Hello, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the sunlight and the posters, and thank you for coming back. The first thing I wanted to start off with is by correcting something I said earlier. I mentioned Edmund Clark's negative publicity exhibition, which was on view at ICP. It is still on view at ICP. It will be up until Sunday, and he's speaking tomorrow night at ICP, so I encourage you to check that out. If you haven't already seen it, it's an incredible and very important exhibition. And the other exhibition that's on view with it is also really relevant in light of today's conversation. It's photographs from the Japanese internment camps. So check out both of those before they come down. I'm so thrilled and honored to introduce our next speaker, Nicholas Mirzoff. Nick is a visual activist working at the intersection of politics and global digital visual culture. One of the founders of the discipline of visual culture, he is an award-winning author and a professor of media culture and communication at NYU. He's currently working on a project entitled The Appearance of Black Lives Matter, and today he'll share thoughts on the urgency of reframing histories in the context of this political and cultural moment. Please join me in welcoming Nick Mirzoff.
Hi everybody, can you hear me? Right up there in the back? Am I audible? Yeah, okay. So thank you very much for having me here. Thank you to Kristen, to Magnum, for inviting me to this really significant event. And it's an important day. It's May Day. Happy May Day to everybody. Happy May Day. So May Day is two things. May Day is the general strike for labor. We've had a celebration of May Day since 1846. Began in a settler colony on Australia, spread worldwide. Rosa Luxemburg famously said that we will continue to have a general strike on May Day until all our demands have been met. I think we can fairly safely say that all our demands have not been met, can we not? So we are still striking on May Day. But if we repeat the phrase, if we say May Day, then we are issuing a general call of distress. And there is good reason, there is good cause to feel that we need to issue a call of distress right now too. So I want to suggest that we are in this moment then, which is doubled. Our history is doubled. It repeats itself. It returns. It's ancestral. It's a moment in which we are undergoing a shift in what I'm going to call the conjuncture. And the conjuncture is the way that economics and politics and ideology and culture connect. And those connections, when they work, seem normal and given, but they're not. And right now, they're shifting. And the points of those connections are the places where what's sayable and what's visible come together, articulations. There's also places where one might make photographs, but I don't want to think just of photographs as being prints or something that takes material form. I want to think of photography as a set of relations. So what we're doing now is photographic. What we are engaging in when we march in the streets is a form of set of relations. In creating those moments, we have to remember the land on which we are. We're standing now on stolen ground. So Lenape land, ancestrally. Broadway that you might have used to get here was the Lenape Trail. But it's a doubled space as well, because in the 17th century, when the Dutch took the island from the Lenape, they also gave some of the land to enslaved African labor to grow food for the white colonists, and they called them half-free, particular Dutch form of enslavement. And so where we are was also, in the 17th century, called by the Dutch, land of the blacks. So that tells us then that we cannot simply be counter to history, because there are many histories that have to be remembered, many histories that have to be negotiated. So on a May Day, we find ourselves negotiating those temporalities. Here, for example, this is a gathering of people on general strike. These were enslaved men, women, and children who left Confederate land and crossed the Union lines in 1861 and assembled for the purposes of being photographed by Timothy O'Sullivan, as it happens. But that's not the point. The point is they're sending a message to us, asking us, have we fulfilled the conditions of the general strike? Have all our demands been met? Very clearly not. Very clearly we still need to respond to these people. Our conjuncture is shifting. Now, some of us have been here before. This is one of the few benefits of getting older, is you start to see things in a slightly different way. A couple of years ago, I left capitalism's target demographic, 18 to 54. I'm no longer desired by capital. It's not a bad thing. But I remember in the late 70s going through the conjuncture shift that produced what we now call neoliberalism. And at the time, Stuart Hall, writing in the projects of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, focused on the ways in which we might understand this, capitalism as a global system being the interaction of the colonial and the metropolis that produces poverty, pauperism as he called it. It seemed to them at that point that there was a phase of control and expulsion. Clearly, we are in another such phase right now. When we think of migrants, whether into the European Union, now calls itself Fortress Europe, the border wall that Trump continually harps on about, which of course already exists, but it is now a structure of feeling as well as a physical structure, controlling and organizing university spaces, academic spaces, intellectual spaces, as well as physical spaces. And the critical insight that Hall comes to as a result of thinking this through is that race is the modality through which class is lived. So our mediation of our opposition to capitalism as a global system isn't simply counter. It comes in the form what I want to call anti-logic. I'm borrowing this from Cedric Robinson's remarkable study of black Marxism, in which the historical anti-logic to racism, slavery, and capitalism is what we're trying to find, but it will not, as Fanon understood, create a synthesis. There won't be a resolution, a nice, neat tying up. So our anti-logics are many. They are anti-colonialism, anti-fascism, anti-hierarchy, anti-homophobia, anti-patriarchy, anti-racism. You can add to these. They are multiple. So we find ourselves in this doubled moment, a moment that Fred Moten has for a long time called in the break. We're in the break between conjunctures. We are trying to follow Fred again, consent not to be a single being, to think about how we can work together as a group. And in his recent poem, Moten has reminded us that the word group was first used to refer to a collection of figures in artwork before it was used in other contexts. It might be a way for us to reimagine it now. But we're also, as Christina Sharp has said, in the wake. We're in the wake in that we are following on from the historical catastrophe. We're in the wake in that we are in mourning for the loss of so many. And on May Day in New York, we should remember Eric Garner. We should remember Stephen Clark, Sandra Bland, so many thousands more that are gone. And we are in the recoil, which is the third meaning of in the wake. We're in the recoil of all the systems that surround us. We need also to think then of the work that images do in relation to capital. The very prevalence of the term image stems from John Berger's famous book, Ways of Seeing, that was published in the last moment of conjunctural shift in the 1970s. And for Berger, the image is simply the representation of a site. But now, an image It's not just as we thought of it then, a form of currency that would lead to a set of possible exchanges of ways of seeing the real. Images are themselves the ways of creating, generating, and mobilizing capital. So this is the report by Mary Meeker, who is a venture capitalist, who is the kind of digital guru that all the venture capital people follow. She publishes an annual report, what's happening with social media and the internet. And this is her report in 2016. And you can see that the frontier for her here is that presence will become all visual all the time. And this is now in a context where today, on any given day, 3.5 billion photographs will be posted to Snapchat as snaps. Every minute, 400 hours of video get posted to YouTube. Every year, 1.2 trillion photographs are taken. And that's a very low-end estimate. It depends on how many photographs you think people take before they post. So men is probably 1 to 1, women is probably 1 to 15. So somewhere in the middle, you get this estimate. Huge numbers of images then, mobilizing capital. Why is it so interested? When Snap went public, out of your labor, posting your snaps, out of nowhere, $20 billion valuation, one day to the next. That's real money, even now. Here's Instagram. Look at this ad revenue. This is in billions. 6.84 billion this year. That's last year, actually. And that actually constitutes now about 30% of Facebook's advertising revenue, because Facebook owns Instagram. So you may have left Facebook. Are you still on Instagram? You're still making money for Zuckerberg. Lots of it. Lots of money. And increasingly so, because it monetizes, it works. And the reason for all this, again, Meeker identifies this because it's old news for them that it's visual. Now the question is, why is it working? It's a little bit more complicated, but this comes down to a thing that they call conversion. Essentially, this is like when there's an ad on the internet, most of the ads you see are text links like Google. Hardly anybody ever clicks on those. 1.4 to 4% conversion rate. Images, people click on 21% of the time. So it works. Their level of sophistication is very minimal by comparison with the kind of things that we saw this morning. But it works. It makes people buy things. That's all they care about. So there's a very high level of opportunity to reach people because we, on average, spend about 5 hours a day on our phones. As we're doing that, we're allowing for these opportunities for images to convert to capital. So we will then need to start thinking about some other form of understanding the work that we do. Because images aren't actually working right now. It's a photograph taken by Jeff Mitchell, who's a press photographer. He won a prize from one of the major press organizations in 2015. And what it's showing are refugees from Syria and elsewhere crossing, at this point, Croatia. And clearly what he's interested in is the way that they're self-organizing, the way that they're formed into a neat column. It's quiet, it's orderly, it's progressing in this very remarkable way. And then a year later, this odious man, who's called Nigel Farage, made a poster out of this image. And he attached to it a tagline, breaking point. The EU has failed us all. We must break free of the European Union and take back control. Now, the media judgment on this poster when it came out in June of 2016 was immediate, that Farage had gone too far, that this was absolutely reprehensible, and he had guaranteed the defeat of the Brexit referendum. In fact, the results showed the exact opposite, that he locked in that extra few percentage points that they needed at that point to guarantee the success of this. So the image that Mitchell made, and he protested its use, but it was licensed, and there's nothing he could do about it, has been used to diametrically opposite purposes than he wanted. What I'm going to argue for is that we need to think about another term that Berger uses in Ways of Seeing right after he starts talking about images, the question of appearance. How might we appear to each other, not as a single being? How may I appear to you? How may you appear to me at the same time and in engagement? And I want to think about this in the terms that are posted by Lady Longsoldier, who's Oglala Sioux poet, whose book Whereas came out last year. And if you remember nothing else from this presentation, just go out and buy this book. Do it now while you're on your phones. Convert immediately, because it's really a wonderful book. And early in her book, this is the third poem, she creates an idea of what I'm calling the space of appearance, because you have to say something that relates to Hannah Arendt when you're in the new school. It's a law, it's actually in the contract. But not Arendt's space of appearance, because that's limited and it's contained and it's controlled. But this is the poem that Longsoldier writes. This is how you see me, the place in which to place me. The space in me you see is this place. To see this space, see how you place me in you. This is how to place you in the space in which to see. Now that poem literally revolves around, or more exactly squares, that which I can't read and I can't say, but makes the poem into what it is, which is the space in the middle, this space. The space of appearance, the space in which you and me might come to meet each other unequally, unevenly, because history and ancestry will not be so easily disposed of. But we might make our way through these spaces. And elsewhere in the text, Longsoldier makes it clear that these gaps in the text are known in letterpress as white holes, if you put two spaces next to each other. So they are, as it were, American white holes that allow for a way in, a racialized, a difficult way of entry. The poems as a whole have many words for that space in the middle. At one point she calls it Indian emptiness. That immediately corrects that, say, the Oxford English Dictionary, still colonizing the sentence, says one must say American Indian emptiness. So then we have American white holes next to American Indian emptiness. The square space, later in the book, in simple linear form, stands for land, stolen land, the land that we have to think about rectifying. Who appears and how might they appear in this space? I thought this might be news to some of you, but it was nominated for the Turner Prize a few days ago, so I'm just catching up. But this is work by Luke Willis Thompson working with Diamond Reynolds. And you'll remember Diamond Reynolds because she did the Facebook Live broadcast with Philando Castile from the car after he had been shot in St. Paul, Minnesota. Minnesota, Longsoldier tells us, Minnesota, turbulent water. In that moment in the car, she's live, she's Facebook Live, she's still alive, but she's threatened directly by the gun that you can see in that broadcast. And in this moment, in between the shooting and the trial, she came together with Luke Willis Thompson, who is from Aotearoa, New Zealand, but is of Fijian descent, to create what they call an aesthetic for herself. So what they did was they filmed her on 35mm film, projected it, actually about that size. For once, you're actually seeing it about the right size. In a darkened room, and there was a large film projector right where the gentleman's filming me is standing, literally at the vanishing point in all senses. It's very noisy. The projector creates this kind of white noise in Longsoldier's sense around the room. And as that loop continues, she slowly lowers and raises her eyes in two different performances, and it loops eternally. It's about 8 minutes long, and it travels around. I couldn't photograph it directly on because of the way that the room was organized. In that moment, then, it's possible for her to appear. She must be silent, because legally, anything that she said, because it was between the killing and the trial, was discoverable. So if she had said anything about what had happened, it could have been used and entered in evidence. In the same way that Long Soldier's poems, whereas, used that legal formula, the whereas statement, in the advance of any legal text, in which nothing actually has legal force. That's where the apology to Native Americans, put into law by Barack Obama, is placed, in the whereas clauses. It means nothing. It has no relevance. So we need to evolve and discover new ways of looking. And this is what I call persistent looking. Continuing to look at these things which the police, in all senses, but also literally the police, would rather we not see. And this is an evolution of an offense under slavery called eye service that then became what's called reckless eyeballing under Jim Crow, and it persists today in the prison industrial complex. It's a man called Matt Ingram, who was the last person to be formally tried with that rubric in 1952, thanks to a campaign by African American media here in Ebony. He was ultimately acquitted in North Carolina. And I wanted to show you this because you see that he's standing in front of a Confederate statue, and very deliberately placed there, and it's in the caption too, by the photographer to remind the audience exactly the conditions under which this situation had taken place. Any form of looking, any form of eye contact is potentially dangerous in this country. As we know, Emmett Till reminds us of that. And yet, during Black Lives Matter, we saw moments like this. It's a young man called Lamont Record. He's 16 years old at the time that this photograph was taken. This is the day after the video of Laquan McDonald was discovered and made public. And he is confronting here very directly the police. He is looking at them eye to eye. And we'll see here that that police is himself African American, because this is not about individuals. This is about systemic racism, systemic hierarchies of oppression. And neither of them are willing to back down at this point. This is an encounter that continues. We are still in the break, in the wake, trying to think these things out. How then might we think to decolonize? How might we move forward? We'll be talking about that right after me, so I'm just going to say a couple of things very quickly. We still work under this presumption of eye service, this idea that under slavery, any enslaved person who looked directly at a white person could be punished for that. So that looking is directly criminalized. And we now need then to find tactics to not simply counter, but to oppose in the form of AntiLogic that eye service. So I'm going to suggest two quickly in the time that remains. One called redaction and the other fallism. So redaction is pretty simple in this form, at any rate. It's a form of editing. It's a form of taking out. Redaction is something that, of course, the FBI usually do. Whenever you ask them for a Freedom of Information request, you get back this thing with everything blanked out. But Christina Sharp, in her book In the Wake, has suggested that there can be another form of redaction. And this is something that, unbeknownst to me, I was doing this without knowing that it was going to be called redaction. Because during the course of Black Lives Matter, activists said, it's enough. We no longer need for people to see the broken bodies of those who have been hurt. But if we do that, then we lose that possibility of persistent looking. So in this example here, I took a still from the video where Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times by Chicago police. It is unbearable to watch that video. And cropped it very simply so that you don't see that, but you still see the space around it, the space of what I would call non-appearance, the space between the highly glitzy, private spaces of urban centers in metropolises and the protected, gated, CCTV, suburban spaces of the privileged. In between, we find spaces like this, in which there's a bus stop at which nobody will ever wait for a bus that never comes. There's a chain link fence advertising for some real estate development that may or may not be completed. Weeds growing on the sidewalk, indicating how little anyone cares. No one cares. Someone dies. In another instance, this is the dash cam video that records the arrest that led to the death of Sandra Bland in Texas. And this almost fulfills the stage directions for Waiting for Godot, a country road, trees, evening. No one's present in the photograph here as I've cropped it. And this tells us something, because Sandra Bland was arrested for failure to indicate a lane change. To whom was she supposed to indicate that lane change? It was in fact only to the police, who were behind her with their sirens on. She tried to get out of the way and was then arrested for this. Here again we see an emptiness. The whiteness of climate-changed southern sky, power lines waiting for the next storm to fall. No one sees, no one cares. Someone dies. To think about how we might decolonize that space of non-appearance and create the possibility of encounter, South African decolonial activists have proposed to us the idea of fallism. All must fall. Monuments must fall. But also, museums must fall. And I want to take that a step further in the few moments here that I have to think about the American Museum of Natural History and its collections of African objects. There are 36,000 African objects in the Museum of Natural History. Just think about that for a minute. Why are they there? This is the catalog describing profoundly important African artwork. Today, I downloaded this week, as male figure fetish. What it actually is, and I had to photograph it myself because the object is not properly photographed in the catalog and it's turned the wrong way around, is a form of ways in which we might create appearance, ways in which we might create relation. This is an anti-colonial device. It's a means of contacting the ancestors and connecting the living to the world of the ancestors. But it is also visibly a camera that is a sheet of glass in front of the figure. This is a powerfully syncretic figure. The nails, which are used to send messages to the ancestors, were derived from the nails that are used in Christian iconography to depict and denote the Christ on the cross, but also martyrs like Saint Sebastian. Christianity has been present in Congo since the 15th century. And we can connect, thinking about Laura's presentation this morning, you connect Renti-Congo at the beginning of the photographic era through devices like this to the devices that you all have in your pockets, your phones, your computers, because in all of those there are pieces of Congo, rare earths and rare metals that are found in Congo and are mined at great cost to local people there. If we look at that catalog entry again, it curiously says it was acquired in 1955. That seems odd. It's right on the edge of Congo becoming an independent country. But it's not true, because if you look into the catalog itself, in the handwriting here, it says, been in the museum since 1900. Very rough date. The 1941 on the other side isn't a date, it's a catalog entry. So in other words, this idea that museums keep these things because they look after them properly, no, they have no idea what this is, they don't know where it is, they don't know what date it is, where it came from, anything. We should simply give it back. What else goes on? So about Christie's catalog in 2016. Somebody made a mashup here connecting Modigliani to a ballet mask, as if this was somehow an appropriate thing to do with African art. Small sale raises $5 million. Evolution of form, African and oceanic art are the genesis of modernism. So again, those of us that remember, we remember the primitivism show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1984, largely forgotten. The catalog for that show had an Nkisi figure of this kind on its front page as a kind of emblematic figure of primitivism. They're anything but. They're emblematic, syncretic figures. And we need to think about that in connection with the figure of the global migrant, who is the symbol, I think, of our contemporary conjunctural shift. And I won't have time to fully go through all of this. But I just want to highlight this piece of work by Sami Balogi, who's a Congolese photographer who did a long sequence of work called Memory, superimposing photographs of colonial Congo onto contemporary sites. And here he's connecting again the Museum of Natural History to contemporary Congo. So the top image, as you're looking at it here, is the diorama of the gorillas in the American Museum of Natural History. And the bottom is the exact same site. And you can see the mountain rhymes visually. Today, it's a refugee camp now near Goma. People who have been driven out by the constant civil war and fighting that goes on in Congo. Under colonialism, 10 million people, according to Adam Hochschild, died in the genocide in Congo. Since the beginnings of our contemporary conjunctural crisis, about 3.5 million people have further died in Congo. They migrate mostly to Europe on boats of the kind of which we've now become familiar. And yet, when people do things like this, and they remove, this was a statue of Leopold II that was on top here, was taken off. American activists, we have some work to do. We have to actually take the monuments. It's not been returned. And they wrote a text onto it. Congo Free State and Congo Horrors, explanatory text equals necessary. I would say so, yes. So we would need to think of all of this. We would need to think of what holding the gaze would mean. This is contemporary Congo work, photographing in reflections. The Nkisi figure has glass on it. The operator, the Nganga, wore a mask that also had reflections on it. We are living in the wake, in the break, in the double. So we need then to empty our museums, to empty our institutions, to start again, not just to counter them, but to create an anti-institution. So this is a mashup that was made by Liberate Tate of something that I wrote. So that Liberate Tate made the image, I wrote the text. And it said, I want an institution, a museum, a gallery, or whatever, that doesn't reproduce white supremacy, that doesn't represent a prison, in which there isn't expropriated labor, there isn't extinction, and there isn't genocide. What would that look like? I'll leave you with that question. So I think we have a few minutes for some questions.
A few minutes for questions. Nick has to run off to class and won't be with us for our Q&A at the end of the day, so we have a chance to converse with him now. So any questions from the audience for Nick? Comments? There's one
Way over here.
down here. Katerina, do you have a mic? Robert?
Nick, one thing, be sure to put the credits on your photos, the credits for the photographers' names of the photos you used.
Which images?
All of them. The photo of the line of people from Syria, on and on and on. Just put photo credits on there. It'll help your reputation.
Okay, thank you for that. Robert?
Okay.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Nick, do you have questions or comments for any of the speakers earlier this morning, or any of the ideas that you heard that you want to engage before you need to run off?
I was just going to say really quickly, I just wanted to make sure you knew about the artist Ken Gonzalez Day. They're an LA-based Latinx artist, and they have a work right now at the National Portrait Gallery in DC. And what they're doing is they're going through archives of all of the Latinx lynchings that have happened ever in the United States. I think their collection is like 1,000, and they've taken the actual body of the victim and removed them from the archive, and that's the only thing that they're exhibiting. So it just reminded me a lot of exactly what you were doing in the examples you showed. But Ken Gonzalez Day, they probably relate.
I'm wondering if we have MTL Collective in the room.
Tasha's here, right?
Do we? All right,
Yeah,
guys.
better.
Hey, do you want to give a brief intro to your friends, and then do you want to also join us for this?
So it's my great pleasure to introduce my friends from Decolonize This Place in MTL. Hussein and Natasha Dill, who will be talking about their work in Decolonize This Place, and they led an action no? Yeah? What are you talking about?
Well, we can begin.
Okay.
We're
go
not talking
go
about
ahead.
our actions. but-
All right. Over to Amin and Natasha.
Thank you, everybody, for inviting us here, and also Nick for that nice introduction. Happy May Day, first of all. And I just walked in, and one of our friends just walked out, and we heard that there's a strike going on at New School. And then also just like thinking through everything that's happening around the city with the Columbia MFA students also demanding their tuition back from the MFA arts program, and other things. So I just wanted to start with that and just say, I just wanted to acknowledge all the invisible labor that is often not seen, specifically, labor of women of color, indigenous, black, brown, and, some of the things that are not visible. So happy May Day. So we are here today to just give a prompt. We're not here for a presentation, just to raise some questions and to see what comes from that. If you could just put up a slide. We just have one slide for today. Okay, so our prompt is, can photography be decolonized? So me and Amina from MTL Collective, we began in 2010. We met at International Center of Photography. We were trained in photography from the starting. And then since then, we've started several projects, but one of the most recent ones being Decolonize This Place, which actually began with a photography exhibition called This Place at the Brooklyn Museum that was putting into question the exhibition, which tried to view Israel and Palestine as a neutral space. So what we did with the exhibition was point out to the funding of the exhibition, who curated the show, how the Palestinians were represented in it, and then also the call to BDS in relation to Palestine. The reason I mention all of those is just because to think about, can we really think about photography to be decolonized, just as a prompt, and can we think about that together, especially when we know photography is a colonial tool. Nick just mentioned, mining in Congo, so that also goes with camera equipment and also, our phones, and it's impossible to escape. So at the same time, what can we do? And what can institutions look like? What can museums look like? What can photography look like? And in that context, what do we mean by what would be decolonial space within photography, right? So one of the first things I want to say is that decolonization is not a metaphor, as Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne say. So what does that mean? That land is central, so we have to begin with saying that this is an Nape land, we're an occupied land. What would that mean? And so to think through some of those prompts. You want to end?
Yeah, it'll be a difficult conversation, so we're inviting that. And to the extent that Nick's presentation seemed removed, we're reminded with the strike that what we're talking about actually is probably wherever we are. So we're interested as photographers and cultural workers, how do we think of acknowledgement of the land, how we think of Black liberation, how we think of degentrification, how do we think of Palestine, how we move away from issues of talking about color as a question of diversity, where institutions can just check boxes, and more interested with what does collective liberation look like, right? Where we are, not in the future, not based on some program, not based on some party, but actually in our day-to-day lives. And I think that in a way, we are all struggling with many issues. And one of the things that we want to do with you is open that space up to the type of organizing, the type of thinking. And here's how I can connect it just as one example. When Nick was talking about redaction, we often also see things like affirmation of life. But what we see less of is a reorientation of the camera, a reorientation towards each other. What would that look like? Then the question probably comes up, well, who would be interested in that? Which raises the question, why do we do what we do? And sometimes we do what we do for a job and not for the struggle. And if that's the case, that makes sense. There's a lot of us, and we're on different pages. But to the extent that we want to bring down those barriers between how we live, what we believe, and what we do in our life as work, that would be the space to come to. And then the other thing I want to say is that we're approaching this from an intersectional perspective. Decolonization is a messy process, right? It is not meant for an academy. It's not meant for a mic in this, but we need to find each other in all the spaces that we can, right? And if to the extent that this sounds odd, then, you know, we talked about Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter. You can look at just what 70 people managed to do at the Brooklyn Museum in terms of raising issues and changing the conversation. We're interested as people of color, as people who are both complicit in oppression, right, and are being oppressed, to figure out how an institution like Magnum can be supportive of the work that we intend to do in an era like Trump, where we can also say in the same breath that Trump has existed on this land since 1492. And so this reorientation of the camera, thinking of these institutions as spaces for us to grow and for us to struggle and for us to live and breathe, and not just think that we take an image of a protest and somehow we're activists, or that the lens is neutral, or that if we make decisions on certain images and they can't be shown, we still have to deal with the market. We know these are real issues. We're living them. But if we can find each other and have those kind of conversations, then potentially with institutional support, because we also know institutions are complex. At the top is usually capital. At the bottom are people that care. And in a museum, you have programmers and education people who love what they do. And I teach at NYU, and I teach at the New School, and I teach at Pratt. And most of my students are of color, right? But at the end of the day, we have to take a job because we have to live, right? And usually we have to live, the choice we make it for ourselves at the expense of others. And we don't like that choice. And we want to reject that choice. And we have an opportunity with Magnum to have a real conversation, and it doesn't happen like this. To the extent that you're interested, they're going to be sending out an email.
Yeah, I think that's the plan too. And the conversation will be on September 27th. So, yeah.
One last thing. When I say decolonize this place, I'm talking about over 30 grassroots groups that include artists, organizers. We carry multiple identities, right? The American Indian Community House, Insurgent Poets Society. We're talking about
Black Youth 100.
Black Youth Project 100, Anti-Brooklyn Gentrification Network, Equality for Flatbush. We know that we want to live in the city and do the work and live, and we know that we're displacing others in the process. We're not talking about guilt here. We're talking about looking at these issues together from the vantage point of being photographers and cultural producers.
One last thing I would say on that is, just as a note to think about, you know, when we think about decolonial spaces, and especially in the context of photography, I think one of the first things that would be talked about is, do we really care about representation? Do we really care about inclusion, but inclusion in what system? And that's the system that we're questioning. In the context of the United States, it's a settler colonial system, which institutions are part of. How does that change our relationship to photography? But really creating this space. Is it possible to create a decolonial space within this institution, within the field of photography?
So thank you all. Can we please give them a hand? Thank you. The issues that they brought up are critically important. So my name is Noelle Flores-Teilhard. I'm part of the programs team at the Magnum Foundation. And one of the reasons we're bringing this conversation to the fore is that in a lot of ways, issues of diversity and equity are kind of baked into what we do at the Magnum Foundation. So the mission statement is expanding creativity and diversity in documentary photography. And that's kind of can be read two ways. It's both in terms of form, encouraging experimentation and diversity, but also bringing more voices into the field. And I think that over the past 10 years, Magnum Foundation has really been able to do that in really significant ways. And this engagement with the MTL Collective and also the Black Lunch Table, which is another event that we're going to be having in the fall, I think really shows our willingness and our commitment to bringing these issues to the fore and to kind of grappling with them and encouraging for your feedback. This is a process, of course. So with that, let's see. Well, I wanted to just briefly also take a moment to talk about our photography and social justice program, which is often sometimes kind of seen as a pipeline for diversity in the industry. And we bring in fellows from all over the world. They come to New York. They have mentors. Some of the mentors are in the room today. They go back to their home countries. They produce projects. Photography and social justice, again, grappling with issues of activism, of race, of what it means to be an artist. And also the Magnum Foundation Fund, more than half of the grantees of the Magnum Foundation Fund come from areas outside of Europe and Western Europe and the United States. So, this isn't a perfunctory gesture. This is very much a critical value of the Magnum Foundation. So on that note, Decolonize, we'll have a conversation about decolonization in photography on September 27th. And also the Black Lunch Table will be doing artist roundtable and a Wikipedia edit-a-thon on October 27th. So please mark your calendars for that. And also wanted to just briefly, Nick's talk was very, very interesting. I think there's some thinkers and people that we can, I'm just thinking here of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote Decolonizing the Mind, I think in the 50s, Frantz Fanon, of course, Bell Hooks, Stuart Hall, Mark Seeley. There are so many I was taking notes during his presentation of others that we can think about and consider in terms of when we're having this conversation, people who we should keep at the forefront of our minds. So we can move to the next slide. On this note, Alexandra Bell she can't be with us here today, but she offered to show this video, which was produced by the ICP, so thank you for allowing us to share this video. So Alexandra Bell is an artist who consistently challenges problematic representations. She's a multidisciplinary artist who investigates the complexities of narrative, information consumption, and perception. Utilizing various media, she deconstructs language and imagery to explore the tension between marginal experiences and dominant histories. Through investigative research, she considers the ways media frameworks construct memory and inform discursive practices around race, politics, and culture. And she's a wonderful artist, and this video kind of is a wonderful way to introduce you to her work for those of you all that are not familiar.
I think everything is about race. Black communities, gay communities, immigrant communities feel a lot of media representations to be inadequate, biased. There's a lot of reporting around police violence and Black men. And I realized a lot of the arguments that we were having were about depictions. I started to wonder, how different would it be if I swapped images or if I changed some of the text? And so that was the first time I physically started playing around with the works. This isn't a grammar exercise. I'm really trying to see if I can disrupt subliminal messaging about who should be valued I needed kind of one of the most respected institutions that kind of prides itself on getting this right to kind of say, actually, nope, you're not getting it right, right? The counter-narrative series, the primary way you see it is in public, in the streets. We went to 4 locations between Bedside and Crown Heights area and hung them up. You imagine who might be moving in at like the height of gentrification in many of these neighborhoods. And you're putting this print up of this like dead Black kid. The title is 2 Lives at the Crossroads, equating these 2 lives as if they're neighbors. The Times layout to me perpetuated that. The subtlety there is that this isn't equal. These people are on equal footing. They have equal responsibility in this event that took place, and that's not true. I don't believe that. You have a cop and you have a kid, and there's a responsibility here, and it lies with one person more than the other. I know he was 18. I feel like if he wasn't Black, we would be calling him a kid. So there's a lot of what in journalism is key information. He'd sometimes use drugs and he'd rapped, and I just don't think that that's necessary information. So I blacked it out. Like, oh, that's what you do that's what you do when you're 18. You do drugs and you drink and you rap and you curse. Cause like, really, did you just write in here that you curse? It just goes to show how important images are. It changed the way I viewed the text. Now you know he's a kid, right? During the Olympics and the Ryan Lochte scandal, you have this headline about these swimmers, and then there's this big photo of Usain Bolt. And I remember just being like, what the hell? There's no way if the track team had done that, they wouldn't have been on the front page. People felt like I caught the Times making a mistake. And maybe willfully using the image of a Black man under crime. I found a very good image of Ryan Lochte that was just him alone in the pool. I redacted most of the article, but I also inserted white Americans into the title to categorize it in a way that other races were categorized. I guess there's something restorative about it, kind of restorative justice. You know, online, the hashtag was like white crime, white photo. And that was really funny because people were like, yeah, that's actually a really good hashtag.
When you are done with the stand, move back. Move back. When you are done.
I'm 35, I've never seen a torch rally. Like, this is some shit I feel like I would read about in a book. It was a riot by white nationalists, and I was like, they're gonna get it wrong. And they got it so wrong. It was a side piece. It had 2 columns out of the 5 on the front page that day. If you have a white torch rally, this is a major event. This isn't a sidebar item. For the most part, I keep the layouts how they are, but the problem here was the layout, right? That's the journalistic hiccup here, is that this layout doesn't speak to the severity of these issues. What you give space to and what you allow people to see says a lot. The Tulsa hate crime is a really interesting one because I didn't really make an image swap. Vernon Majors was this white guy. He lives next to this Lebanese family, and he had harassed them for years. And eventually, and unfortunately, he kills the son, Khalid Jabara. It runs with this wonky headline that says he's a Tulsa man and accused of harassing this Lebanese family, charged with murder. Huh, that's interesting. The The Lebanese family had been there for 30-something odd years. I say since '83. And this guy had been there like 7 years. And so I'm trying to figure out why he would get that title. If anybody was to get it, it's Jabara who should get that title. And I removed Lebanese. And I also inserted white American. I was really interested in the way the news can slightly other people. And I used the word racism as well. Because he called the family dirty Arabs, but then it just says harassing. And I'm like, I don't understand why we can't just say racism. Like, they just didn't want to use the word racism. The news cycle moves so quickly that we're all kind of skimming through things and we're just kind of accepting narratives. It's not always this bombastic and in your face. There are these subtle ways that racism works in the oldest of institutions. If it's not this egregious thing coming at you, I think it's so easy to ingest. You might not print Mexicans or rapists. What other ways do you contribute to the thinking about minorities? You have to be able to look in the mirror and go, we're failing in these ways. And if you don't see yourself as maybe just as much of a problem in some ways as Trump, then what work are you doing? What's important about counter-narratives is that it's not meant to be like an indictment of news media. I could almost say that it's just as much as an indictment of the reader. Now, I don't know what impact that will have with the papers, but I definitely know people are saying to me, when I'm reading now, I'm saying to myself, why is this photo here? There's something about seeing a different image, about shifting the size of a photo. It gets at a feeling that people have, but they don't know how to explain it. Where I'm situated as a person in the margins, I think I can see where there are gaps in ways that other people may not. I'm a Black gay woman. That goes very much into kind of how I see the news, how I interpret what happens, what I believe might be an angle that's overlooked. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm more right. It just means I have a different vantage point.
Thanks again to the ICP and to Brian Storm for allowing us to screen that video, and of course to the artist Alexandra Bell for having us screen that. So, moving off to the next presentation, we have Thomas van Houtte. I'm going to go ahead and read his bio while we pull everything up. Thomas van Houtte is a conceptual artist, photographer, and author whose major works interweave investigative journalism, philosophy, and metaphor. He makes images using a wide range of processes ranging from 19th century wet plate colliding to thermal imaging and augmented reality. His projects challenge our notions of identity, memory, and power, often highlighting the slippage of wartime structures into everyday life. Today, he's going to be presenting work on what was formerly the US-Mexico border, which many of us are not taught that it was much further north than we imagined. So the well-known visual record of the American West, dominated by photos of cowboys and white settlers, the gold rush, and the arrival of the railroads, was created after 1848. So images from the Mexican era, on the other hand, were never fixed in our memory. So he's going to show us this really wonderful project that he's been working on for quite a while, and we're lucky to have him here with us today. So come on down.
All right. Hello, everybody. Mic there. So this project is called Lines and Lineage. I took landscapes along the original Mexican border and portraits of descendants. And I just want to walk you through how I got to this process. So first I want to talk to you about the existing photographic record of the American West. As we've talked about today, photography is this amazing instrument for forming our perceptions of the world and our memory of the past. And there's a very, very strong memory and perception of the American West, and that a large part of that is due to photography. So, starting in 1849, a number of daguerreotypists moved into San Francisco and set up studios such as this one. And from that moment forward, we have a very rich record of the American West. Many of it are pictures like this. So these are daguerreotypes taken from 1849 onwards. Most of these are from a collector named Matthew Eisenberg, and they're about the gold rush period in California. Okay, and this became sort of the typical iconography that came out of the West, and there was another important step that happened in California. The photographer Edward Muybridge figured out how to speed up the photographic process and take this sequence of images that was the link to turn it into cinema, basically. And from there, Hollywood took the idea of the West and ran with it. And it is hard to overstate the impact that images of the West had on the American psyche afterwards. So Hollywood's most popular genre for 50 years was the Western movie. And as you can see, there's a visual echo with this Google image search I've done of Western leading actors with those images that you just saw, the first images of the American West. And as we all know, that image and mythology created by Hollywood spread through American society and indeed around the world. So this is an adventure amusement park in Sweden that is based on a Western theme. So not only has the American identity been formed by this mythology, but it's gone across borders. And of course, it even shows up in our politics today. And everybody remember this guy, Roy Moore from Alabama? So interestingly, Alabama is not even a Western state, but here he is dressed in the sort of full regalia of this mythical Western image. But what I want to talk to you today about is the missing image, right? So as I was growing up as a kid, I spent some time in Belgium, and then most of my education was in California. And so I learned about the American West through American school systems, and by seeing these images in small town museums, basically. And they don't really tell the full picture of the West. And so as I was researching this project, I started studying more and more about what had really happened in the West. And you notice many, many biases about how our history is told. There's an East Coast bias, right? We talk about what happened in the United States from the perspective of the East Coast, like the Plymouth Landing and the Mayflower. Almost any American school kid can tell you what kind of hat the Pilgrims wore or why we celebrate Thanksgiving in this country. They can tell, even if you grew up in California, you know less about what happened at the same period in California. There's also an English-speaking bias, and so you have sort of things that English-speaking people did and that white people did reign over other sort of historical turning points. So I want to show you a timeline that I've assembled, a Hispanic timeline on the left and an Anglo timeline on the right. And you'll start noticing that there's probably quite a few things in here that if you grow up in the United States, you were not taught. So on the right side, colonization of Plymouth, the arrival of the Mayflower, probably your average American school kid knows about that. American independence. How many here have heard of the Battle of the Alamo? Remember the Alamo is a slogan that's often taught. On the left side, though, what you realize is that Hispanic first, things that happened long before they happened on the Anglo side, tend to be sort of buried in history or outright ignored. And so that includes the fact that the colonization of this country didn't happen from the east to the west, but happened first in the west, starting in New Mexico. That the oldest church in the continental United States is not somewhere on the East Coast, it's in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and still standing. But where it gets really interesting for me is on the sort of medium left side there, around 1821 with the Mexican Revolution. And this is something that was not taught to me at all as a child growing up in California. But in 1821, Mexico won their independence from Spain, and in 2 years, they had their first black president. So if you're from Texas, Nevada, Utah, your first black president was not Barack Obama. Your first black president was Vicente Guerrero. After that, they quickly abolished slavery, and they gave citizenship to everybody in the territory, regardless of ethnicity, not regardless of gender, but regardless of that ethnicity. And so you have to imagine at the same time in the United States, this is pre-Civil War United States, where the states are evenly divided between slave states and free states. And the other thing that is often not taught is why did the United States annex Texas and start taking the rest of the West? Well, as I said, this links to the run-up to the Civil War. Since the states were evenly divided, if you added one more state, either a free state or a slave state, that would tip the balance. And so President Polk annexed Texas as a slave state. And you can see in this timeline that shows human rights, how late human rights arrived in Anglo history, and especially how they were confiscated from people who lived in the West under Mexican rule. So whereas indigenous people were given voting rights in 1824 in Mexico, the last indigenous people, Native Americans in the United States, to get voting rights were Native Americans from Arizona and New Mexico in 1946. So they had their voting rights confiscated for over 125 years. So there's not just sort of timelines of history, right? But there's visual histories. And as a photographer, this is what I was interested in. And I live in France today. And this is where the first photograph was taken by Daguerre. This is Rue du Temple in Paris, taken in 1838. And if you want to look up photographic archives of Paris, I can find what my old neighborhood looked like in the 1840s, or where I like to walk in the forest of Fontainebleau. You can find photographs of that from the 1840s. So I was curious, could I find the same kind of photographs of where I grew up in California? And so this sort of became an obsession for me, searching for these kind of images from before California was taken over by the United States. And after speaking with quite a few curators, historians, and books, this is the farthest I got. So this is actually an image that was taken in the 1850s, but if you can see it on the screen, the subject is wearing a ring. And there are journals from this family. This is the Vallejo family, or called Vallejo, usually in California. Apparently, the ring that he's wearing has a daguerreotype portrait on it that is probably the first picture taken in the West. It's from 1847, and it was taken by a 12-year-old Latina girl, Epifania Vallejo. And this photograph we see is either her father or her uncle that is wearing the ring, and the ring portrait was of her mother. Besides that, I couldn't find any single photographic record of what's now called the American West before the US took over. This is it. And so I decided that I was going to make that photographic record myself. So I went to an antique shop near where I used to live in Paris, and I asked to buy sort of the oldest still working camera that I could. And this is it. And I taught myself how to do wet plate, glass negative photography in order to do this project. And so the result is a series of diptychs, portraits. All of the portraits are of original descendants of families that have been in the West since before 1848, kind of like Robert Pluma's family that we saw earlier today. And the landscapes are landscapes along the original US-Mexican border. So I'm going to just go through a few of these. So why did I focus on the border? Well, close your eyes for a second, and I want you to imagine the contemporary US-Mexican border. What kind of image pops in your head, right? When I do that, I imagine sort of an arid landscape with this kind of rust-colored fence or wall running through it, and there's probably many photographers in this room who have photographed this kind of scene. In fact, if you do a Google image search, This is what floats up to the top. This is sort of our rough shorthand visual understanding of the current US-Mexican border. But when you look at the old border, I was really swept away with how verdant it is, how you have glaciers, how you have redwood trees, how you have great rivers and lakes that looks completely different. And so what I did is I followed this map. This is a map from 1839, the same year that photography was invented. So if you could have gotten a daguerreotype camera and this map, you could have followed this line. It starts at the present-day border between Oregon and California, then called Alta California, going all the way to Wyoming. So a third of Wyoming was Mexican territory. And then it cuts down through the middle of Colorado, following almost the Continental Divide, takes the Arkansas River, out into Arkansas, down, following the Red River between Oklahoma and Texas, and all the way to the Sabine River, the border between Louisiana and Texas. So let's go through some of those images. An unjust war to expand slave territory. So these are actually not my words. They're the words of Henry David Thoreau. And most people who have been educated in the United States have read Civil Disobedience, but many people that I spoke to had forgotten what Thoreau was protesting at the time. Why was he thrown in prison? It was for non-payment of taxes for protesting the Mexican-American War, which he thought was an expansion of slave territory. You'll also remember that Abraham Lincoln, his first time as a politician when he was elected from Illinois, his campaign was against the Mexican-American War. So at the time of this war, it was incredibly controversial. So I want to show you the map again to explain to you how this war unfolded. So first you've got Texas, the pink area. How is it that this became an expansion of slaves territory? Well, after Mexico won independence from Spain, they started changing a lot of their laws very quickly. And one of the first things they did is change their immigration policy. They wanted to encourage more settlers to move into this area, both people from the southern part of Mexico, but they were also allowing Anglo settlers to come from the east, cross into Texas, and if they naturalized as Mexican citizens, they would be given land grants. Now, most of the Anglo settlers that came in from Mississippi and Louisiana, and they were slave owners, and they brought their slaves with them. And shortly after, as I told you, Mexico abolished slavery, and they started to enforce it. And this is what caused the revolt. It was Texas slave owners that revolted against Mexican administration in the exact same way that 15, 20 years later, slave owners in the South would revolt against the Union. So eventually, the United States, in this perfect balance, half slave states, half free states, President Polk decided to annex Texas, to add it as a slave state. And then on the far other side, in California, a completely different thing happened, something that's been under my nose my whole childhood, but I was still never taught about, and that is the Bear Flag Revolt. So this is Patrick Garcia. He's a descendant of Mariano Vallejo, the person that I mentioned earlier that may be in that early daguerreotype portrait, whose daughter took the first picture in California. And Mariano Vallejo was sort of the highest level commander in the northern part of California. He was at Sonoma. There was a small military barracks there, and there was a mission. And a famous army captain named John C. Fremont snuck into California territory, and he was a believer in manifest destiny. How many people know this term, manifest destiny, right? For me, it's kind of, it's almost this Orwellian phrase that you don't understand quite what it means. I think probably it's just shorthand for white supremacy or white power, basically. It's the belief that somehow English-speaking white people could rule the land better than anybody else, and therefore they had a God-given right to it, right? So Fremont was a believer in manifest destiny, but he couldn't go in, this was before the Mexican-American War started, he couldn't go in and attack the Mexican army, so he did a ruse. He went and found these early Anglo settlers, and there were some in Northern California, who had come in and naturalized as Mexican citizens, and he told them that the Mexican army was coming up from the south and was going to expel them and take away their land grants. This was fake news of the day. This was a completely false rumor, but it was good enough to dupe quite a few people. So they formed a militia. They stormed into Mariano Vallejo's house. They took him hostage, and then they went here into the Sonoma barracks, and they made this flag. And so this was called the Bear Flag Revolt. And this is the flag that inspires the California flag to this day. So, and in fact, anywhere you go in California, if you go in a state park, everybody is wearing a golden bear on their badge. Any sign has a little bear logo on it. So this is, if you go to Cal Berkeley, the bear has become their logo too, basically. If you know the historian Rebecca Solnit, she said that the Bear Flag Revolt had all of the moral authority of a convenience store holdup. So as growing up as a kid, this was never taught. They never taught us anything about the Bear Flag Revolt, and yet this is how my state got its flag and how the border moved 700 miles from northern Oregon all the way down to where it is today, was from this act. And so when I see the California flag today, it has more symbolic resonance with the Confederate battle flag for me than anything else. So who were the people of the West during this period that could have been photographed from 1839 to 1848? They were, of course, indigenous people, people of Spanish descent, mestizo, and perhaps a surprise, Jewish refugees, and people of African descent. So not only did I try to identify specific people that were descendants of early families from this time, but I tried to find people that had a strong link with their history and that reflected the trends of the time. So this is Virgil Ortiz, and he's from the Cochiti Pueblo in New Mexico. He's a sculptor, and that's why he's holding a piece of clay. And one of the themes that reoccurs very often in his sculpture and in his pottery is the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. So when the Spanish first came in and colonized what's today the United States, there was a revolt and resistance movement against them, and it was successful. From 1680, for 12 years, the Pueblo Indians managed to kick out the Spaniards. And then they came back under different terms, and even to this day, if you go to New Mexico, they kind of live in silos. So you'll have a Pueblo community, and then a mile or two away, you'll have a Hispanic community, and it tends not to be one on top of the other, but sort of everybody living in their own little silos now. But of course, at the time, most of the indigenous people were not in contact with the Spaniards. There was a string of missions that the Spaniards had set up on the California coast, in a few places in Texas, and in Santa Fe and in Arizona. But the vast majority of the population at this time, even during post-Spanish independence, were indigenous people living out of contact with any sort of Mexican government. This is Ralph Peters. He's from the Houtte tribe in Northern California. They were not in contact with the Spaniards or later the Mexicans at all. Most of the people of Spanish descent at that time, the main thing that they did was cattle ranching. And in fact, there would be no horses in North America if it weren't for the Spanish, right? So this wild horse, or even an indigenous person riding a horse or a cowboy on a horse, these have become icons of the American West. Also, this is Hispanic heritage, and even the headgear. It goes so funny that you see in the Marlboro ad, they're wearing cowboy hats. Roy Moore is wearing his cowboy hat. When Anglo settlers came to the West, they were wearing top hats and bowler hats. these kind of hats come from vaqueros. And in fact, the perversion or the mispronunciation of the word vaquero became the nickname for buckaroo, another nickname for cowboy that's used in California. Buckaroo is vaquero. So this is Anastasio Boni Lopez. He lives in San Luis, Colorado, which is the oldest town in Colorado. And this is Ana Marie Gallegos de Hauser. She's 105 years old. And like many of the people in these communities, she considers herself mestizo. She's half of Spanish descendants and half of Navajo. She was actually born, coincidentally, the year that New Mexico became a state. California and Texas became states very quickly because they had this huge influx of Anglo immigrants, whereas for years, the population of New Mexico stayed mostly indigenous and Hispanic, and so after repeated attempts, they refused to give statehood to New Mexico. Bernadette Therese Ortiz Peña. So she's also from Santa Fe, and she noticed something quite interesting on the family crest that she had of her Hispanic relatives. There was a Star of David on there. And there's been a lot of genealogical research done in Santa Fe and in New Mexico in the last few years, and it appears that 1 in 5 of the legacy Hispanics that live there, people that came during the 17th and 18th century, 1 in 5 of them seem to have Sephardic Jewish ancestry. Why would this be? Well, in the same month that, this is a quote from the Diary of Columbus, the same month that Ferdinand and Isabella issued the edict that all Jews would be driven out of the kingdom and its territories, right, the Spanish Inquisition, in the same month he was given his orders to discover the Indies. So you had Sephardic Jews that were fleeing the Inquisition, tens of thousands of people, some of them moving into Portugal initially. When they could, people were taking boats to the New World. Many people were faking conversions, hiding their Judaism in order to survive. And many of these people then ended up in Mexico City. In Mexico City, the Catholic Church presence was also very strong, and so they went to the frontier. New Mexico at that time was the frontier. And so this is a theme that's coming up a lot in New Mexico art at the moment, and a lot of people are taking workshops and getting DNA tests for this reason. There's a funny personal link I have with this is that my grandma on my Belgian side also is from a family that's fled the Spanish Inquisition to Antwerp. At the time, the same time that New Mexico was colonized, Belgium was part of the Spanish Netherlands, was also part of a Spanish colony. So these two histories overlap. This is Nathan Alexander Steiner, and he's a distant relative of the last Mexican governor of California, Pio Pico. Now, Pio Pico, if you see a photograph of him, appears to be black. So he was actually a mixture of African ancestry, indigenous, and Hispanic. And his the Spanish before the Mexicans used to do sort of very strict censuses where they would mark down everybody's ethnicity and put them into castes. And so his grandmother was marked down in the 1790 Spanish census as mulata, meaning half black and half Spanish ancestry. This is not an exception, Pio Pico, right? The city of Los Angeles, of the 44 original pobladores, or settlers who founded Los Angeles, only 2 were white. The other 44, 26 of the majority, had African ancestry, and the other 16 were Indians or mestizos, right? So the second largest city in the United States was founded by an Afro-Indigenous community. And this is something that is not taught in California schools, and I'm guessing probably not much on East Coast schools either. So this is Pio Pico. This is a picture that was taken later after American conquest. He became a huge landowner, but his main accomplishment when he was governor of Alta California was secularizing the missions. So it was actually when Spain had created the mission system, they said each mission has to run for 10 years and then hand over the land to the indigenous people. It didn't happen. The priest would try to keep things running. The indigenous people, in many cases, could not escape from the missions. After the Mexican Revolution, they decided they would secularize them, and that was Pio Pico's job. And so then they had all these huge swaths of mission land that had to be handed out. And so it was given as land grants to Hispanic families. There was nepotism. A lot of it was given to his own family. It was also given to indigenous people, and some of it was given to these Anglo settlers that later revolted against Mexican rule. So this is Olimpali. This is a land grant that was actually given by Mariano Vallejo to the coastal Miwok people. This is in modern-day San Rafael in the North Bay of California. So who was the first U.S. governor of California, and what changed after Pio Pico? So this is Peter Burnett. Before coming to California, he was a judge and a politician in the new Oregon territories, and the main battle that he tried to fight there was to make it neither a slave state nor a free state, but a black free zone completely. And so actually Oregon succeeded, and during the first years as a state, people of African ancestry were completely banned from there. But most importantly is this edict that he did when he became governor. A war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. This is in his State of the State address in 1851. And from there, an outright slaughter and extermination campaign happened against California's indigenous people. We think that the numbers in 1848, before the US took over, were 130,000 indigenous people living in California. Within 30 years, that was down to 30,000, and within 50 years, that was down to 17,000. Okay, so this was an outright genocide. He set up 2 militias that were state-funded to hunt for indigenous people, and there were also gold rush people that were going into the Sierra foothills, and they would be paid $5 for each male scalp and a quarter for each female indigenous scalp that they got at the time. So this is Liz Wallace, and she's from the Auburn area of California, which is in prime gold territory in the foothills just above Sacramento. And she's acutely aware of this history and extremely angry and fired up about it to this day. She knows that her ancestors were enslaved by John Sutter, who was the Anglo settler that served as the base camp for the Bear Flag Revolt. And she chose to put on this paint and represent herself in this way for the photograph. Most people just said I wanted to do a head and shoulders shot and they could do what they wanted, and she specifically said she wanted to be represented in this way. She's holding a hammer because she makes art and jewelry smithing with it. And finally, I wanted to show you a picture of a structure from that time. This is the San Geronimo Church, the ruins of it, which is in the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico. Now, I told you how Texas fell and how California fell during the Mexican-American War. New Mexico, as the US Army marched through from Texas into New Mexico, it had very little resistance, and so the United States quickly appointed a governor of New Mexico. But by this time, the indigenous people and the Hispanic people were allied, and so 2 Pueblo warriors went in and assassinated the American-appointed governor, and then they fled up into the hills. And so they sent the US Army from Santa Fe to go get revenge. The people knew they were coming, and so 150 civilians, indigenous and Hispanic civilians, hid into this church, and then it was surrounded by the US Army, and howitzer cannons were fired on it, killing all 150 people inside. So if you go to Taos Pueblo today, you can still find the ruins there, and then they've built a a new San Geronimo Church next door, which is the one that you'll find in Georgia O'Keeffe paintings and is sort of the well-known one of the West. One final image that I want to leave you with, the picture that I showed you before of a map of 1839. And on the right, we have census data taken from 2011. The source is the Economist magazine, of where Hispanic people live today in the United States. And when I saw this image, having spent some time looking at this old map, it really struck me because the Hispanic population of the United States today, about 90% of it, still lives in these original borders. So even as people try to change the borders, there's certain histories that stayed anchored as communities and cultures grow over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. It's such an incredibly rich and fascinating project, and as somebody who grew up in California myself and didn't learn that history, it's an incredible opportunity to enter into that history and learn more about it. I also want to thank Nick, Natasha, Amin, and Noel for placing us in the current moment and also proposing ways that we can address and engage with this current moment. And I wanted to point your attention to the program that you have, where we have a listing of upcoming programs at the Magnum Foundation, one of which is the conversation about decolonizing frameworks in photography, which will be on September 27th. That's an invitation to join a roundtable conversation, which is about how we can build upon the dialogues that are happening in the field about moving beyond a diversity model and thinking about what are other frameworks we can think about how we change representation in this field. We also have coming up next a book salon with 10 by 10 photo books of RFK Funeral Train, The People's View. This is a project that is looking at the photographs that were taken by bystanders that are the analog to Paul Fusco's photographs of Robert Kennedy's funeral train. So if you've seen that amazing project of his, these are photographs that Dutch artist Rein Terpstra collected from bystanders, from photo albums, personal family photographs of the funeral train. That exhibition will also be shown at ICP, opening May 23rd. As Noel mentioned, the Black Lunch Table will be doing a roundtable and a wiki editathon at the Magnum Foundation on October 27th. And the Chinatown Art Brigade will be doing an event in October as well. You saw that Tomeo Arai was one of our lab participants, and we're also thrilled to have Chinatown Art Brigade artists and residents in our building in the Lower East Side as part of the fourth Arts Block. So again, if you haven't already signed up for the Magnum Foundation mailing list, please do so, and you'll receive more information about all of these events and an invitation to participate in these conversations. So Thomas pointed to some of the ideas that we were talking about earlier about how there are times when a photographic record doesn't exist for a history that you want to talk about, and you have to think about creative ways of creating materials that facilitate a space in which you can have that conversation. And our next speaker is doing something sort of different, something similar, but in text form, in poetry, filling in the gaps of what isn't passed down in archives, what's missing from archives, what's edited out of archives, but are histories we might want to look at and know about. Our next speaker is Ariel Goldberg. Their publications include The Estrangement Principle and The Photographer. Their work includes poetry, performance, research, and photography. And their next book, Heavy Equipment, Prophetic Gestures in Photography's Recent Past, examines the language that LGBTQ photographers used to relate to their subjects before the digital revolution. They teach at Pratt and here at the New School, and write for Art in America and art forums and other glossy magazines. Their work in response to the new biography of Bernice Abbott imagines what is left out of official archives. Please join me in welcoming Ariel Goldberg.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Kristen, for that introduction. And, well, this is a photograph that I took with my iPhone, to be honest, from the pages of Julia von Hoften's just out biography of Bernice Abbott called A Life in Photography. And it's from 1928, and she's in Paris in her glory in her portrait studio there. Very successful beginnings to her career. And she photographed throughout the 20th century and had a romantic partner that the sort of history of their relationship with Elizabeth McCausland, Bernice and Elizabeth, is just sort of coming to light through the research that Julia von Hoften has done. So I'm going to read a little bit from a prose poetry hybrid work in progress that is titled 50 Commerce Street, after the location that they lived in two apartments on the same floor in the West Village. And there's a lot of facts in the work around Berenice Abbott that is historical, and I'm really after the imagination, imagining for myself the erotic, and what has been excised from their records and what they withheld from their personal records as vehemently closeted lesbians. And I think that those sort of mundane personal archives are rich platforms for imagining for me in my writing, and I've been drawn to it. And I just wanted to also say that this is a lineage that I feel invited into. These are white, lefty lesbians, and I'm a white, Jewish, trans, lesbian identified person, and I don't, this isn't representative of all queer history, it's just a specific project that I'm working on. So without further ado, here's a scene from 50 Commerce Street. Despite it being winter, Elizabeth opened the window for circulation as the ink, thick, began to ooze from its splotches. E heard the nasal and terse syntax of the instructor from her letterpress class in college. Every time she held the unscrewed canister with one hand, metal scraper in the other. One need only apply a startlingly little dab. As soon as E turned on the switch, the belt spun like a water wheel gathering energy from a quaint river. Here, the moisture was only from differentiating oils on the gears against the pressing metal parts repetitively. Berenice muffled, talking more to her tripod and view camera than to E. It's going to take me a minute to figure out the best angle and then the edges. B chose for the left side anchor, the floor-to-ceiling white cabinet, where she saw E move to get her apron. That was more like a smock, with a generous pocket where E's thick pen sat. She never moved in her waking hours without her pen being near, inevitably traced to a dripping on her hands and bed sheets. A blot for every moment E paused, hovering over a page or emphatic punctuation. B decided the bottom of the frame would be the matching wood planks and cement floor. In between them, rafts water would seep through. At handling the first print in its firm embossing, E paused to admire it and check for typos. Excitedly, she read out loud to B in a bombastic radio announcer voice. "There is no time for poems. The only poem for now is action. The clenched fist, the lifted arm." "I can't talk right now," B retorted. There were no typos. But E was left alone with a wave of doubt circulating in her stomach and tingling through the nervy veins from her neck to fingertips. But I contradict myself here. Regardless of if there are wars, they are not even calling wars. There must always be poems. If I am making a poem on this loose page, then how can I demand others to not engage in similar matters? Or is this a sort of warning of the last poem? Most expected E's column, which covered both art and politics, and not a poem about action. The list of ills to raise one's arm against overwhelmed her, the color line, the borders, the labeling, some foreigners bad and others also foreign but thought to be otherwise good, the businessmen's disregard for the human in their workers. Oh, the businessmen. E started to exert herself, pumping the plates of the jobbing press. Her heart rate rose more than when she sat at her desk to think, then scrawl, then type. The window only gave view to a thick wall, an alleyway, a shaft, between this building and the next. There was no room for a swinging bench chair or the assumptions that come with porches. This space was optimized for laundry to fall, for dirt to blow, for the neighbors to remain close enough to hear the argument one member of the couple would not even call an argument. When B arrived at her composition, having come in and out from her dark cloth, she addressed the problem of low light in E's printing den. The fixture, a chandelier of utilitarian minimalism, or a fruit bowl turned upside down with a hole carved out for a single light bulb, would consolidate the light into a wash of information. That will be ugly, thought B, but also not central to the action. Everywhere else in the room, including Elizabeth and her press, pointing at a diagonal, needed more to articulate itself. The thought haunted her, I should have brought my lights. Long exposure backup plan with this dim sunlight. I'm almost ready, B announced, as E had finally entered a rhythm. The press invited her not to think anymore about the poem that maybe expressed a desire to embody contradiction with pride. E was thinking about how B was kinder to her when E was showing B how it all worked. Connection being possible before B was preoccupied with her own art. B was more accustomed to living rooms than basements. E had not prepared a pose when B uttered, "Stay still now." And E froze like when the barber pulled his razor against the hairline of her neck. After the sound of the first exposure, E said, "Hold on," still delighting in the memory of impressing B with her command of the press. E knew she had something here to give B she couldn't have otherwise. E got the idea to flip off the switch of the whirling belts of the machine so the metal plates would not blur in the exposure. The wires of the press swayed as they drooped, humble with gravity as they connected to the same ceiling socket as the overhead light. Be exposed by counting in her head 1.5, then switched the film backs 2.5, switch. She did her final exposure with the hopes her eyes of a light meter and tight funds would still yield a good exposure. It was early in their years together. It was their first year. B initiated the portrait, curious about E's alleged mechanical prowess. E finished the run as B broke down her camera parts into her travel bags. Then E fixed B a whiskey. Then B watched E clean the machine with alcohol and rags, then baking grease. The pamphlet drying on the rack, E pulled out some of her other work, a party invitation, and a denim-bound book entitled Hot Nights. You can have this copy, E said. She leaned in, handing it to B, reached for her waist, then found her lips. E turned B against the scratchy brick wall and kept kissing her as B awkwardly held the book of poems in her one free hand. All right. That's a little excerpt from 50 Commerce Street. Thanks for listening. I will say also that Elizabeth McCausland and Bernice Abbott met when Elizabeth McCausland wrote Bernice's favorite review for her Changing New York show in the early 1930s. So they sort of met through art writing and photography. So another fun piece of history.
Thank you. That was beautiful. All right. So for our next conversation, I'll go ahead and do the introductions, and then we'll get the two chairs up on stage. So we're really excited to bring together two colleagues, Oluremi Onabanjo and Mimi Chironongok, together for a conversation this afternoon. Mimi is a Magnum Foundation Fund grantee from 2017, someone we are really excited to support, somebody who works very conceptually, which was exciting for us at the Magnum Foundation. As you all know, documentary practice has many different ways of, can function in many different ways, and so we were excited to be able to support somebody working more conceptually, and of course, a young African woman. So we're really excited to have them in conversation today. I'll read the bios. Oluremi Onabanjo is Director of Exhibitions and Collections of the Walter Collection. Remy's research is informed by the relationship between photographic imagery and the social imaginary, and retains an overarching objective to mine the tensions between art historical, anthropological, and critical readings of visual and material culture in Africa. Mimi Chirono Ngok was born in Nairobi, Kenya, where she is currently based. She studied photography at the University of Cape Town. Her experiences growing up between Kenya and South Africa have engendered an intimate body of work centered on issues of home, displacement, loss, and identity. Please welcome.
So towards the end of 2014, I was introduced to the work of Mimi Chirono Ngok, and I thought to myself, this is important. Here were tender, melancholic compositions which spoke to particular sites and spaces across the globe, but seemed to transcend such earthly constraints. The next summer, I spoke to her about a few aspects of her practice, and I do feel that in some shape or form we've been in conversation and dialogue on many registers since. My continual refrain, I feel like her images bring us closer in order to unhinge expected notions of geography or the passage of time. As writer Nilika Jarwandana so elegantly phrases, with Mimi, photography is an act of defamiliarization. None of the images are place-marked by the names of particular cities. One may be able to point out scenes of Dakar, Accra, Kampala, Abidjan, Kigali, Nairobi, Berlin, but can never be sure. Nightshade green leaves, slivers of oceans, or uniform blocks of buildings and impersonal interiors, each of these markers of place and location blur into the other, providing a temporary home to the solipsistic journeys that photographers often make. With her continual peregrinations, such ethereal scenes unfold along an emotional cartography, rather than a geographical one. In images such as these, from installations entitled Do You Miss Me? Sometimes, Not Always, and Always in Spite of Everything, Mimi offers us what she calls a series of vignettes on travel, loss, memory, and the impossibility of getting there when you need to the most. Unflinchingly aligning her work with the emotions that push and pull her through life, Mimi examines first and foremost with the heart. While itinerant, but often returning home to Nairobi, the images of which are shown in the following, Mimi uses her camera as a means to record familiar subjects and sites, astutely observing the spatial and emotional bounds of domestic interiors. With her work, the key premise is to consider the personal as the starting point, the point of departure, so to speak. Rather than regarding the photographic medium solely as a means of archival or documentary investigation, she explores emotions in an itinerant manner through the image. With a photographic practice that focuses on presence, not passage, I feel like her images can take us anywhere. So to consider the fulsome and expansive project that she's presenting today and what we're going to discuss, the S2C project, there are many points of departure to consider. This is a photographer who's invested in collecting memories of the places encountered and envisioned. So she's well suited to explore visual and historical impossibilities in the most granular way. With Mimi's interest in documenting the familiar, the everyday, the mundane, she helps me do the most important and often overlooked visual work, to face the counter-histories, which is what we're all here to do today, those gaps, those fissures, and the non-events that live in the negative spaces of master narratives and the structures of history. So all of that to say, I'm a big fan of her work, and I'm super excited to be here.
Thank you, Remy. Okay. Uganda, northern and Nile provinces, scattered showers and thunderstorms in the afternoon. Western, eastern, and southern provinces, isolated morning and afternoon showers and thunderstorms. North Busoga, South Buganda, and central provinces, scattered morning showers and thunderstorms, cloudy afternoon. Rest of Uganda, sunny and dry. Esther Chesire is a project I began, or I started to think of years ago. Esther Chesire was a Kenyan student that went missing in the 70s. She was living in Kampala, Uganda, studying at Makerere University. And on the day she was supposed to travel back to Kenya, she went missing at Entebbe Airport. So just to give a brief overview, what ended up happening is I got the grant from Magnum Foundation and I decided to do an investigation of Esther Chisire and what happened that day. I met with her family, I researched with National Archives, but a lot of the information that's available in National Archives is scattered and not concise. And the family did not want a reenactment of the story because Esther Chisire's body was never found and it is unresolved what happened to her. I ended up working with the Mohammed Amin Foundation. Mohammed Amin was a photographer in Kenya who worked from the 60s till the early 2000s. And he has, his foundation has an archive of 3 million photographs and I think hours of footage that they still haven't digitized. So I ended up going there physically and selecting images. And then this is one of the images I selected. I gave them an overview saying, I'd like images from the 1973 to 1979 in Kampala in East Africa. We ended up finding images, but not specifically related to students or universities. And it was hard to come up with a personal narrative of what happened. So I ended up making an abstract narrative of the story. I was interested in it because I am a young woman traveling around the world and what it would mean to go missing at an airport. So the image we're looking at now is Idi Amin doing a rally in central Kampala. And I wanted to show, like that is the image I found and what I ended up doing with them. And usually I would find everything and put it together and start cutting it up, trying to see the possibilities. I wasn't interested in a linear narrative because I'm not sure what happened to Esther Chisire, but more in creating a document that could have a historical record that she existed and that something happened to her. And as I was working on the project, it was right after my father had passed away. So I was dealing a lot with grief and issues of loss and absence and what that meant for me and on a personal level. And I think it reflected in the zine that I produced where there's a lot of, it's quite minimalist and there's a lot of emptiness within the images as well as an abstraction of like who is in the image, what's happening. It's not always direct or clear, it's more implied. So the zine starts with an image I found of Entebbe Airport, and I chose to focus on the airport repeatedly because it's the center of the story. And with this airport, a number of things happened in the 70s. As Chisire goes missing, it's also the time where Indian Ugandans were sent into exile by Idi Amin. And in the year 1976, I think 3 months after Chisire disappeared, an Israeli aircraft was hijacked in the same airport. And Benjamin Netanyahu's brother, Yonatan Netanyahu, was the leader of the rescue squad that went to Entebbe Airport, but he ended up dying in that operation. So it was a number of things happening with this airport that seemed quite dense, and I wanted to keep coming back to the image over and over again. I also used archival images of the city and what Kampala looked like in the 70s because it looks very different now. And again, using like aerial shots to reenact like what it means to zoom into something and come back from it. And I guess because cities are a part of my work and to look at cities in a different way, to think of archives in cities and what we keep and what's not put in history or national archives. So what I liked about the Amin archive was it was personal. It was this photojournalist who took images from across East Africa, and then it was something that could be altered in the way I was working with it. I didn't have to stick to a story. I could use whatever elements were more interesting to me, and to like revise that and use that as an iteration. So again, this is the airport. And like each page in the zine has the airport and then another scene. And I wasn't interested in a literal narrative of what happened. I think I wanted to like put Esther Chisire in people's minds and put her in the canon of like art and art making, and make a record of her existence for myself as well. I've thought about this story for years now, and it was personal because my mother is the one who told me about Esther Chisire. My mother was a student also in the 70s, and I think like so much was happening at that time. So I feel Esther Chisiri represents that moment where there was a lot of student protests in universities, there was a lot of state violence against students in universities, and as much as it's a departure of my work, I thought it was an interesting investigation into loss and absence from an archival perspective. So yeah, again, Entebbe Airport. So with this image, there's two things happening. The first in the background is where the man is crying. It was images I found of Indians who left or were leaving Uganda. So I looked a lot at like images of train stations, airports, buses, because when Idi Amin issued the decree, I think he gave maybe 48 hours for a lot of people to leave. So it was looking at like what it means to suddenly have to leave your life immediately. And there was quite a sizable Indian population in Uganda, which is the same in Kenya. But to see like the difference in how both cities have evolved with Indians still being present in Kenya versus in Uganda, where there isn't that much presence of the Indian laborers who were there in the 1900s. And I also picked it because I think I identify with the man crying. It was a tough year for me working on this project and thinking about like loss and absence and what it meant for my father to leave. So I wanted to take images that had a personal resonance for me, and to use them in the zine as a form of like placing myself in the object. And in the foreground, you have the microphones. So that's Idi Amin being interviewed by a number of journalists. And part of the reason why you don't see his face, or I cut off elements of his face, is because I didn't want the story to center on him. I think in the 70s in Uganda, a lot of the things that people discuss are on Idi Amin himself and what he did, but I was more interested in what happened around him, or what are the stories that are forgotten because there's such a huge narrative around one person, and to combine those things together because it was a direct result of his order that Indians were leaving, but to put it in a personal way where you see someone crying because they have to leave a place. And then that's the full shot of the airport. So I'm interested in like repeating it over and over again because it almost feels like a film still. And then like when you fly into airports, they become more in focus as you get closer. So that's what I wanted to reproduce by doing it in the zine. So I took a lot of images of cars, movement, airports, because again, it's about, I think at its most basic level, it's about moving. So Esther Chisiri goes missing at the day she's supposed to leave. She travels to the airport and she's picked up by the State Research Bureau before she gets on the flight. The friend she's traveling with does get on the flight. I didn't manage to meet her. I've tried quite a number of times. So I wanted to think of ways of how a moment can change your life. 1 minute you're on the bus going somewhere, the next like something happens, you know? And Esther Chisiri, 23 years old, very young woman. She moved to Makerere because she was chosen for a scholarship. So when I spoke to her sister, they felt that like she was a brilliant student and her life had been cut short in such in a very violent way, but also in a way that didn't make sense to them. So they never had any answers about what happened, and her parents actually were brokenhearted by what happened. I think the sister decided not to pursue any more leads because they felt it wasn't adding any value to their life to keep uncovering or unpacking the story. So in this shot, again, it's the airports, and I decided to use a hymn. This is in Kalenjin, which is the ethnic group I'm from. It's a hymn that was sang the day my dad died. So we were at the hospital and our extended family came, and it literally translates to, it's a well-known hymn. It's titled Do Not Pass Me By. And the last line is Mamite Age, which means there's no one else. And again, just using personal elements of what was happening in my own life and putting them in the zine, because I wanted it to be an expression of Esther Chisiri's life, but the collaboration that happened as I encountered her life and I worked on uncovering the experiences she had had. And I'm also interested in using text that's not a European language. So Kenya is a British colony, and predominantly we speak English, and the other official language is Swahili. So a lot of some of my images are titled based on Kalenjin names. I use the image Remy showed of my sisters is titled Chebet and Chemo in the garden, because I think we take it for granted that we don't hear those kind of names in relation to photography, in relation to art. So I wanted to use text that's not familiar to a lot of people and to place it in there, not as a form of being exclusive, but just to disrupt ideas of what we should use in photography as text, and create new narratives just by using languages that we haven't exposed in this way. So this is what I've shown is just a sequence of the zine and the combinations I came up with. And the zine shows the text that's in the zine is the hymn, as well as the temperatures and the climate. And I picked up because I looked at a lot of newspapers from the period, and what I was drawn to was the horoscopes, which, because I'm a big horoscope fan, and then temperature, what was showing at movies, the listings of movies in the newspapers. And temperature is important to me because, it's the climate of what was happening then, but just atmospherically, I think a lot about my work as being like a wave. So to think of creating this atmosphere, and how do you do that? Literally, with aesthetic decisions, as well as listing the climate that was present at that time. And then something that I've had difficulty with is everything is in Fahrenheit in the US, but I grew up with Celsius. So just those little details are really important to me, and they kind of indicate the location and where you're from. And then the temperatures that I grew up with. So in general, Nairobi is usually 28 degrees on most days. I don't know what that translates to here.
I'm not asking the right
Okay, yeah. So just how seasons are different depending on where you're coming from. And I think the zine represents that, how it's this object that contains a lot of personal elements of my life, but personal elements of the location, of the space, as well as historical elements of what was happening at that time. So this is the last image in the zine. And I'm gonna end slightly early so we can have questions from Remy. The last page, the first page and the last page contain the weather report. The first page is Uganda, where Esther was flying from, and the last page is Kenya, where Esther was supposed to fly to. Kenya, Lake Basin, Western and Eastern Highlands, cloudy mornings isolated to scattered showers and thunderstorms in the afternoon. Coastal areas, isolated morning showers becoming clear later. Rest of Kenya, cloudy with isolated showers and thunderstorms. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. That was exciting. I'm really struck by when you were describing the project, the notion of the atmospheric. That was something that we see in the zine, but also I feel generally is something across your entire practice. There are these moments of specificity, right, especially in the details that you're giving us, to the temperature, to this moment, the fact that we're seeing Entebbe Airport from continually various aspects and iterations, but then it's all surrounding this non-event, right? So how are you able to access or convey an expectation of something that happens but doesn't happen at the same time? And I wonder for you, I guess you'd mentioned a little bit going towards the project, what kind of challenge that is, because how do you recreate the atmospheric while not having something be the subject?
I think the kind of work I'm really interested in making, or that I've been thinking a lot about making, is that moment before or after something happened. So I think initially a lot of photographers think about the decisive moment, which is interesting, but what happens in those gaps or absences where you catch someone a little too late or a little too early, or where there's that you don't find whatever you're looking for. How do you create a story around that? And initially it was, I felt this is a challenge and I'm not sure how to go about it. But I think it forced me to expand, what do I consider storytelling? What do I consider narrative? How do I go about creating things that other people can understand? And sometimes it's not about having all the answers at once, or having an understanding of what you're doing immediately, but the process around it. I'm really excited about the zine for myself. I feel it was a good beginning in the Esther Chisiri project. It's going to be, I believe, like a multidisciplinary thing. I don't think I captured enough in the first iteration to stop, and I want to continue as I think more about what happened or what didn't happen, what was the day like before she left to the airport. So there's so many possibilities based on these absences, and I think they're only, I only became aware of them because I started to look at them instead of looking for like an event. I considered what happens with a non-event. How would you tell someone the story of a non-event, basically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also how do you tell the story of a person whose very existence is drawn attention by the fact that they're not there anymore? I also am interested in your encounter with archives, and specifically the archives or the images that kind of provide you with the materials for the zine, but also with the people who were institutional gatekeepers or perhaps personal gatekeepers, and also this investigation, or really this reflection on investigations, right, occurring at a moment for you also in loss. So if you could tell us a little bit about those encounters.
Yeah, I think that was hard because I didn't assume I would find a lot of information, but I thought I would find something. And when I went to the National Archives in Nairobi, as well as the museum, National Museum, there were things missing, like newspapers from that time, or like they weren't kept in the, consistent order, or people weren't interested in finding things, or I'd ask, okay, I'm looking for images or information about universities from the 70s, and someone would be like, we don't have that. But it's a huge archive, so he can't make that decision, and to work around that was hard. And that's also why I was excited about like Mohammed Amin, because they were very giving, they were very generous. And I've been thinking a lot about like what are the histories that are contained with like photographers who didn't work for the state or who have their own photographs that are not digitized. Maybe that's the archive I should be thinking of, instead of assuming National Archives will be a place where I can find information. So it was a bit of a divergence from what I intended or I hoped to do. But there's so much to discover in terms of archives, and working in Nairobi, there's not a lot of artists who are interested in that at the moment. So it feels like it's this big space where I can try different things and figure out if it works or it doesn't. The only downside is like being dependent on institutional gatekeepers, because maybe there is something interesting in the National Archive, but I can't access it because this person doesn't think so, you know? So I keep going back because it just depends on who I meet and like what they're willing to make available. It's not completely closed off, but I don't think of it as my first option.
I guess also I'm also interested in the more personal identifications one could have, right? We talk a little bit about like your own practice being one that is contingent on movement and itinerancy, on returning home, right? But also moving through spaces. I wonder in future iterations of this project, which in and of itself is experimental and abstract and has multiple phases, where you're thinking about that going. Would there be a different step, or would you also be thinking beyond the material in relation to your own practice, more deeply being wedded to this archival interaction or exploration?
Definitely. I think once I stopped imagining that it had to be finished in one way and look a certain way, then like there were so many more possibilities. So I feel like this is part one or chapter one, and there's going to be a series of chapters which can either be archival as well or integrate like the more contemporary work that I'm doing. And I'm really interested in like looking into film as a way of telling part of the story, as well as text, because there's a number of things that happened with Esther Chisiri. So she went missing, and then there was an inquiry, but like the person who was supposed to testify at the inquiry also ended up dead, and it was just like a lot of information. So I felt like breaking it into parts allows me to deal with each layer, and approaching like part one or part two is dependent on the information that I have or that I'm gathering and what's the best way to put it together. So I think it'll be an integration of like the work that I'm making as well as like what I come across in archives as I keep going.
I also wonder about your relationship to the word reenactment, perhaps, in this entire project, because it's not necessarily a documentary recreation, but it uses documents and it uses information that could allow us to perhaps access that. So how do you, I wonder if you're tiptoeing around it or teasing at it, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about reenactment.
I was really interested in a reenactment, and that was my first thing as well. But when I sat and met Esther Chisira's sister, she wasn't happy about that because she felt it was all speculation about what happened. And I had to figure out, like, this is still quite personal for them. It's not just a project or a zine, it's something that happened. And I need to respect that and have some integrity about dealing with it. And maybe when that option came off the table, I started thinking of, like, does a reenactment have to be literal? Does it mean that you, like, reproduce exactly what happened? Can it just be a combination of, like, these are the things that were happening during that year, and I'm discussing them in relation to Esther Chisira. So I don't think I'm tiptoeing around it. It's more like, it has a presence in my mind, but maybe it's unresolved, or like what a reenactment could be. And I don't know, just like, I feel the project is magmatic. It's going to shift and change form depending on so many things. Also, as the year goes by, like when I started in March and I finished in September, I was in such a different place from where I had started and what I anticipated. And I felt like there's still so much to do. So like I have to kind of limit myself at times and like focus, because it just goes in so many different directions. I get distracted. So the reenactment is something I've thought about, but maybe not now. It could be something I like do in 2 years, or once I speak to the family again and like hear more from like her sister and the rest of the family, I could approach it differently.
I also am interested in thinking about the airport as a place where you're continually returning to. So both as an image that we continually encounter in the scene, but also maybe conceptually for you as a means of like returning back, or once you're getting distracted, how do you get back to the place of the non-event, the airport? I also think about airports as a place where time is stilted, doesn't really exist. It's where you're crossing various regions. What has that meant for you as an entry point to thinking about the project, but also about time itself?
Well, I spend a lot of time in airports, so I think that was also why I had an affinity to the image. It was a place I was familiar with and I was always thinking about. And I guess this intersection that the airport represents, you're leaving, you're coming back, it could be home or it could be vacation, like so many things. And I felt like, looking at the airport in this way collapses time. Like it could be the beginning or it could be the end. It doesn't have to be linear. To think of like elliptical narratives, what does it mean to like circulate around something? And then how things happen simultaneously, conflicting, like I don't have to make a decision and go in one direction. I think airports represent this object that you can have so many things happening at once for so many people, and it's all housed under this like one platform, let's say. So it made me think of airports even more, like what they represent to us, what they represent to me, and how I kind of take them for granted. I can't imagine like going to catch a flight and ending up missing. But I think that happens to a lot of people. Like we take for granted how violence is quite normal sometimes, that it happens on an ordinary day. It was sunny, like clear clouds, and then something changes. So it's made me think of like the underbelly of airports, what happens when things go wrong, but also how just like it contains so many things. It's everything and nothing at the same time.
And also for me, conceptually, of course, it's like you're going up into the clouds. It's thinking about lives and afterlives. It makes me think about whether you consider multiple lives for Esther, the afterlife, like this being the port at which she could be accessing that place, but also in the various narratives that you encounter about her, right? It's the question of, Did she have a partner who also was arrested around the time when she went missing? Was she going home to get married? I mean, who are the other people in this network for this woman whose non-existence or, disappearance of this particular type of existence, keeps people in particular places of waiting?
In a limbo. Because so when I spoke to her sister and I was telling her, okay, this is what I found. So Esther Chisire ended up missing, but a number of people said it's because she saw something or she saw her boyfriend go missing, and then that was a result of he was murdered. So because she witnessed it, something happened to her. But her sister Zipporah said that's impossible because Esther was coming home to get married. And then, but her fiance also ended up dead a month or 2 months later in suspicious circumstances. So there was a lot of things happening, again, with time. Tempo.
And all relating to some sort of state violence,
exactly.
Right, in that way too.
Yes, yeah, and intersections. But when you think of the afterlife of multiple lives, I imagine maybe all these things are possible, that maybe Esther did have a boyfriend in Uganda. Maybe she was also getting married. None of it is untrue or true. And to think of the possibilities that can emerge if I focus on that element of the story. And I also wanted to do the zine or this project as a kind of going away, a ritual for her, because I felt sometimes people go missing, or a young woman went missing, and it wasn't that important. So I wanted the book to be almost like this ritual, and that's why I also used the song that they sang when my dad passed away, a mourning song almost, to let this person leave. And I think there's afterlives and multiple lives possible for her in terms of the project and what I can do with it. So not necessarily to keep her name alive, but to allow people to understand the experience or to access it through these objects that I'm creating, and to have a dialogue about loss and absence from a very personal place in relation to my life, but as well as this young woman.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Remy.
Thank you so much to both of you, and I'd like to invite onto the stage our friend, our president, our inspiration, Susan Mycelis. Susan is a photographer, educator, artist, also one of the founders of the Magnum Foundation, and our board president, and somebody whose own work is deeply embedded with histories and archives. And she's going to give us a few concluding ideas for the day, and our panelists and our speakers from throughout the day are invited to join us on the stage, as are any of the artists who are participants in the lab, who I know some of you are here as well.
So, rather daunting task. I love that the idea of my role is to make remarks, This is an unofficial,
Make sense of it all.
Make sense of it all, that's even better. I mean, like all of you who've been here, those of you who've been able to be here this day, it's been so rich and diverse. And I'm happy to know that the Magnum Foundation continues its path of creating new forms and bringing in diverse voices, which has been the mission for 10 years. I'm not sure I can make sense of it all. I mean, I scribbled some notes, and I was thinking, can I even do what would be called a basting stitch through different bits and pieces? I'm not a historian or a scholar. I love that we had historians and scholars and artists and activists on the stage today, sharing different perspectives. And, that's the first takeaway, just how rare that is, that we have the richness of that. Then I was thinking about the notion of the archival process, that we probably all came in with the idea of counter-narratives, and we were going to read and hear about the digging process, and inevitably archives provoke this kind of reconnecting, and yet what we're talking about here is creating new dialogues with material, with families, with communities, and between generations. And I really love the different projects intersected along those lines. And also, we've talked a lot in time over the idea of authorial voices, the single author, towards the landscape of more collaborative practice. And so the very personal storytelling of Thomas, the way you rediscover California, your own history, the bear flag in Cheyenne, digging to understand what was left out of family history. Collaborations and just the richness of the interference, digging up and sharing the miscellanea of history, and with no particular purpose, but just to inspire interactivity. And counterpoint to the Village Live, where you're wonderfully drawing on an archive. You didn't even say, if you knew him personally, how you discovered the archive of the photographs and the video, or maybe I missed it. But just this idea that there's someone, we've been talking about ghosts of the past, the idea that there's someone from the past who's guiding us today in the present, which resonates a lot with Laura Wexler and what she was talking about, Douglas, or Hector, imagining what might be a history that could be on a more appropriate history on a monument. And of course, those of you who are here for both Laura and Nick, the richness of provoking us, forcing us to have a different kind of density conceptually. You know, Alexandra Bell, for me also, I took a few of some of the specific, this idea that the news cycle moves so rapidly, which works very well off of Nick, and that we do too easily accept narratives, that we look at the mirror, and then she provoked us to think, what work are you doing? So that's just a line that I've underlined. What work are you doing? And clearly, Mimi, you're doing a lot of work for us. And I also appreciated that she commented to not criticize. It wasn't to criticize us as readers, but she's forcing us to think about ourselves as readers and question what, and rather than assert what we know, maybe continue to ask what's missing, always ask what's missing, or what we are not seeing, or what we're not able to see ourselves. This idea of needing to actively seek to fill in our gaps, and that is an ongoing lived experience. And even in Nick's visual diagram, the idea, this is how you see me in the space in which to place me, and MTL asking us, do we really care about representation? I mean, how can you not go home thinking? So I love also the imaginary versus the so-called real that we've opened up with Ariel and Mimi in particular, and all this idea that there's so many opportunities in the absence. So intersectionality, we should have a conversation, and any of you who have questions and other comments, we would welcome them. Or while you're thinking about what you might want to talk about, I think it's always great, since you were all in different parts of the day, probably here for most of the day, and not everyone was. Are there things that resonated for you? I was just stitching through the things that kept coming back and circling for me, and absence was so strong. You know, from the beginning of the day, for you, Chien, for Mimi, your idea, I mean, again, to make, what do you make with the absence? How do you move beyond the absence or feeling the loss of something? How do you act? So there are a lot of different directions we could go. I don't know who wants to. Anne, you're the most tangible making sense of the absence. But does anybody want to pick up on that while others are thinking?
That made me think about something, and one thing that kept coming up when you mentioned questioning rather than asserting what we know. I feel like your project does a lot of that, and I think that Nicole also is asking a lot of questions. And something that, when looking at my dad's FBI file, everything in, whether it's the government surveillance archive or my parents' sort of personal propaganda archive, everything is asserted very strongly. So it's either, you know, surveillance saying he did X, Y, Z, or their own stuff where they're, you know, trying to put forth their socialist, anarchist views. It was very rigid, and I'm realizing as I'm moving through the project and as I'm growing and knowing my parents, it's moving more into these subtleties and just questions, and that's coming up in my teaching practice too. And especially because of my background being a documentary photographer, I feel like as journalists, I often fall in that category. We're supposed to know. And as a teacher and as a parent, I'm supposed to know. And I really appreciate how many of these projects, like you, really engage with these questions and the unknown and becoming more comfortable in that place, which is not always, doesn't always fit that well into this documentary or journalistic authority.
I can just add to that. I think I found quite a lot of resonances with Mimi's work, but obviously we come from very different approaches. It's about a similar period of history. It's about state violence or colonial violence and state amnesia following that. I think because I did my first 2 degrees in history, I've always struggled with this notion of fact and truth seeking. And then I became a journalist for 15 years, and it's all about finding out what actually happened. I've come upon a point where 6 years into this research, I can't know a lot of stuff. So I'm beginning to look for strategies to get around that. And ultimately, maybe it doesn't matter what the facts were. Was my grandfather a communist? I think so, but the family's adamantly against that because it's politically not safe to talk about it. So, does it matter in the end? So I'm just starting to grapple with this kind of stuff, and it leads back to the, going into the imaginary.
That makes me think of another question that for some of you, maybe more than others, this idea that you cross out of the boundaries that were set in your minds as to who you were supposed to be and out of the boxes in which you're defined. Thomas, you've traveled a great distance, literally backwards in time to recreate yourself in a medium that was not the first. I think, didn't you begin with digital? Wasn't it digital, or were you doing analog when you were traipsing around the world trying to find the last communist states wherever they were? That's a long distance of travel. So let's.
Yeah, I had a very brief analog beginning to my career as a student, and then the very first year working as a professional, I had to shoot and develop color film every day for the Associated Press, and from then on it was all digital. So this was a huge coming back to go analog. But speaking a little bit to what Chian said, I didn't study history, so it's great that you have a historian's background. I sort of wish I could go back in time and do that. I studied philosophy instead, but what I found myself doing, certainly in California, was trying to apply the same journalistic rigor that I had applied when I'm on North Korea's border or in other places, and I felt like people around me hadn't done that, the education system hadn't done that, and in a place like California, there's certainly no excuse for that. There isn't, state censorship. You have some of the greatest universities in the world, and yet the history that is right under our noses is generally unexamined, and falsehoods are just perpetuated to generation after generation without excuse. So sometimes when you look look close to home, you find even more to report on than far away.
Were these boundaries different kinds of boundaries for you, Robert? Did you explore a new boundary from your perspective? Because I don't know what it meant to begin to imagine this project in AR and where you began. Because I think part of what we're trying to do is open up that curiosity that leads you somewhere you don't know the end of that trail. It's the beginning of a process. But I have no idea what you were doing before you started the San Antonio project.
It's kind of hard to know where the boundaries were for this and what was even possible to dig up. One of the big inspirations for the project was knowing how much of this history is really just lost forever and just being resigned to that fact. And feeling that sense of urgency, with Tia Emma, my grandfather's aunt, and thinking, okay, this is an amazing moment. And not just, with my family, not even just with this particular story, there's so many circumstances like this where that's what makes this work exciting. We have this opportunity to capture something that might not present itself again. And so I want to keep trying to dig further in terms of pulling out those stories that might then be lost.
Do we have any questions out there yet? Stand up and shout it out if you do. I have a question for Remy, because I encountered this myself, and I just wonder, I know you're going on for a serious degree in art history. So what do you make of a Robert digging up a history without the training? He's not gotten his master's in history, like Chien, and Chien's maybe authorized to dig up her family history. How do you feel about the people who are discovering and activating and crossing the boundaries that might have been set before?
I think that's important. I mean, unquestionably, perhaps is it a question of methodology that you're posing here? Like the importance of the work, I think, across the board is absolutely needed. And perhaps, I mean, if it's a difference in approaching the work from a practitioner's perspective, a research perspective, I think a lot of what today's presentations have shown us is that they remain vital and important and could perhaps propagate inspiration and thinking across the board. I mean, yeah, to me, I think that's quite a positive thing.
Well, because we so often, even whether or not as practitioners you kind of migrate out from the channel that you were, or the track as it were, the question is, can we create these new opportunities to learn from different disciplines? And how do we do that? If you're not getting a master's or a PhD, you're on your own digging around. How do you learn the methodology? So maybe we need some workshops that are actually bringing all those cross disciplines together outside of, I mean, we happen to be sitting at the New School, but none of us are really here, right? We're all out in the world. Thomas, what do you think? Who would you like to have on your dream team, your working team?
Well, I mean, I get most of my inspiration from my wife, who luckily does have a history degree, and she does a lot of historical documentaries in France. But without having that collaboration and an outside person that knows that methodology, I would be without inspiration and totally lost, basically. So I would love to link up with more historians. I think there might be too big of a gap between people who are interested in visual history and written history, and the power that visuals have on forming memories and perceptions are so strong that maybe that's a good area for cross-pollination for workshops.
I have something to say really quick. I think it's great when people in history say, go ahead and do it. I found messing around in architecture, architects say, no, it's good that you aren't coming from the field. Like there's other things that you're exposing and encountering and bringing up. And I just want to thank you formally, using a microphone, for saying that because it's, you know, a constant worry. But at the same time, like the projects come and, you know, what are you going to do? Not do it? Right? They're calling and nobody else is going to do it. Like that's what often drags some of us into this position anyway. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah. I would also ask, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I would also ask you and also your collaborator and other radical educators here how, you know, we think about like, we aren't allowed to do this, we don't have the skills, but you work with high school students all the time working on archives, so I guess I would ask you, what kind of questions are you asking to initiate some of those conversations among high school students, because we could apply them to ourselves, and that could be a really helpful way of, you know what I mean? Like, how are you starting those conversations?
It would be great to have them all written down. We haven't written anything of that part, like the inquiry method. But I think like at the intersection, right, you know, especially people in the arts and education, like it's so interdisciplinary, right? And I think that's like what is liberating about it. And also too, having the history being, like the questions being decided from the young people as opposed to from like a methodology and an institution or like a bunch of things that I'm not really as concerned about as the people for whom this history is like most important. And somebody who actually never really had a history class except for, you know, imperialism. I went to a radical lefty school in the 80s in Ann Arbor. So like I feel like it's an opportunity. So yeah, I look forward to working on this with you because there's a lot of this coming out right now in the way that it did in the 70s and 80s in K through 12 particularly.
Well, just thinking about the concept of boundaries and people who are not necessarily trained historians or teach themselves how to be a historian doing historical projects or counter-historical projects, I think it's important to recognize that I believe that like we're all inherently interdisciplinary, and that it's in the interest of certain institutions to create the boundaries, and that, you know, it's also like somebody like Bernice Abbott, out of sheer necessity to be financially independent, as, you know, like an independent white woman in the 20th century who made all her own money and did all her own projects, that she was also like a curator and an archivist of Eugene Atget's work and curator of her friend's work, and Elizabeth McCausland, who I was also writing about in their relationship, was an art critic, an art historian, and also a poet. And that like the desire for me to write this sort of like fan fiction erotica was that I felt that there was collectively in the field of historical work on Bernice Abbott, from Julia von Hoften, and recently also this artist Anna Craycroft, who did an exhibition called The Earth as a Magnet at the ICA in Boston last year, that there was a pretty firm establishment of people kind of troving through the archives to get the facts, and that the thing that was missing was the sort of imagination. And, you know, going to what, you know, and it's also, I'm trespassing through people's lives that, you know, where they're now dead. And so I have that permission in a sense, but this is something that was vehemently denied when Bernice was living. You know, lesbian photographers celebrate, you know, and I'm also writing a book of history about, you know, a lot of lesbian photographers at the end of the 20th century. And I have to stick to facts very clearly because their records and their histories really are not in Western history. So somebody like Kushila Brooke writing to Bernice Abbott in 1985 saying, I want to present a paper on you at the College Art Association, and Bernice saying, you can't say I'm a lesbian. I'm not a lesbian, I'm a photographer, is a famous quote of hers. You know, it's sort of like I vacillated into the poetry and the fan fiction because I'm also writing this very strict history. So the interdisciplinary nature of it is sort of within me already.
Just to pick up exactly on what Ariel was saying, for me, fiction is a methodology that like allows me to expand and think of things in a different way. And whenever I travel to different cities in Africa, like a friend of mine was telling me how sometimes you have movies that are dubbed over in the local language because a lot of people don't speak English or French. And I loved that. I love that people kind of make up what they think the movie is about, or sometimes you'll have screenings where one person has the mic and they kind of like translate everything that's happening in the movie, but you don't know if it's true or if it's really talking about the movie. And I thought there's so much room in that, in that gesture, in that action, and to try and mimic that or integrate that in the things that I'm doing. So instead of trying to like be a historian because I appreciate it, but to think of ways that my discipline or the way I work can bring a new methodology to the information.
Any questions yet back there? There's someone up there. Sorry, it's impossible. You're all dark.
Thank you so much for everything that you presented. Amazing, I'm incredibly inspired. I wanted to ask whoever wants to respond, and everybody can respond, would be amazing. For someone that wants to start a project and you know, need some guidance into the first steps, into getting into a project where you know there's some history, but you also are going to dive into probably going through the journey, trying to figure out what happened. In this case, my personal story, grandmother. What would be either the first steps into starting the project, or the first questions that you would ask yourself, or that you did ask yourself?
That's it. You heard me? I screamed. Yeah.
I think we heard. Who wants to jump in on how did the process begin? What are the first steps? Steps going down a path I'm guessing that you don't know where it's going to lead, right? I mean, the first step is daring to take the step.
In my case, felt like I was really like pulling on strings, and each one would lead in a vastly different direction. I didn't know that when I started this project, which I thought would be just specifically about the geographical space, the border, it would bring me into Jewish history and Afro-Latin history. I knew it would bring me to indigenous history, but I learned so much more than I imagined. So you kind of need to find something to hold on to, a starting point. If there's a relative in your family, almost every family, there's like one crazy uncle or aunt that is into the family history or genealogy or drawing family trees. Like, find that person and get as much information, and you will find a handhold, something that will give you, some string that you can pull on and follow that down. But I would love to hear from Chi-Yin on this, because hers sounded like even more difficult, since it was much more personal history rather than official history.
I'm provoking Chi-Yin to answer this question. She keeps saying, what? Another kind of response, because I think Thomas gave you one sense, but I was thinking of Chi-Yin telling me some days ago about the challenge to get out from what others expect you to do. And she can perform very well for any number of a range of possibilities of publications, etc. But taking that step out from the path in which you're performing one part of yourself to explore some other part of yourself in the unknown. So that one, the fact that you said that it was 2011 when you started this journey, that's a long time, right? To be patient with yourself, to give yourself the time to not know what it's going to add up to and how you're going to perform yourself on the stage today even. But you made a bit of a leap. So how did that leap happen?
You want me to tell the life story?
The life story.
No, were you asking specifically about working on family histories?
No, I'm asking about the process, the first steps to start, that you started, yeah. Your first steps into starting, or what were the questions you asked yourself in order to answer in those steps?
Yeah, so as Susan said, it's been a very, very long process. Obviously, this is personal work. I juggle many, many things as a freelance documentary photographer. I do everything from assignment work to long commissions, and then I was kind of stringing this along for over almost the past 7 years, and I've come upon a point where the research has gotten so massive that I can no longer continue living the way I live, and I'm now thinking of folding it into a PhD because I can't really figure out how else to do it. What questions did I ask myself at the beginning? I think it was this curiosity and fascination with this figure of the grandfather, and I think I knew I was out of time. So as Thomas said, find that old person in the family and sit them down and really start doing all your oral histories very diligently. Many people died on me before I had a chance to talk to them, including my grandfather's sister, who died in 2010 summer when I was here on the first Magnum Foundation Human Rights Fellowship. So you lose a lot of information when people die on you. And often those pieces of information are key. That leads to different questions, a new set of questions. Each person you interview is like opening a new set of doors for you, and the lines of inquiry get more and more and more. It's quite complicated. You have to work on different levels. You have to work on the official archive level. You have to dig into your family history. You have to figure out the landscapes in which these things happen and work with those different layers of memory. And whose memory is it? So I've been collecting everything from documents to making photographs to collecting oral histories, doing the oral histories and collecting them on video and audio, making portraits. I've been collecting songs sung by these revolutionaries, songs that they remember from 70 years ago. So it's multiple layers and multiple directions with many questions. How do you get started? I think just do it. There's a time factor involved. These people die, so don't take anything for granted. Even start with your own parents, trace back from there. And in terms of crossing disciplines, I think we are in an age of more and more multidisciplinary practice. So I think we all have to do more and more things now if we so choose.
Hi, so I have a question. I think with the exception of Alexandra's work, everyone's digging from the 80s and beyond up to kind of like hundreds of years ago. We're living in a time now where everything is hyper-documented. There's more pictures being taken. There's more things being written. How do you think that's going to affect artists and historians and archivists in the future who might want to go into projects from now?
I mean, one thing that I think, first of all, I just want to answer one thing about getting started on your project is one, it is doing it now, but another can be waiting. Like, I have known about this stuff I'm working with for a really long time, but also just taking yourself very seriously, because none of us here has a license in photography. Like, it's not like being an RN. And so, like, I'm a photographer because I say I am. And so your project, you carve out time for it. And if you have constraints, like for me, I'm really glad that daycare ends at 5:30, because that has an artificial constraint that makes me feel like I got to move on it. But talking about looking at stuff moving forward, there are two conversations that as a photographer I don't participate in anymore. And one is the state of our industry, because I understand it sucks and I have no answer to that. And the other is that there are like too many images and my images are getting overwhelmed, because I have thought a lot about this, and that's not the part of this work that I practice in. People do really interesting work about the multiplicity of images as a concept. But to me, my interest comes from social documentary photography, where the relationship with the person I'm photographing and the image itself matter a lot. And I need to be able to pay really close attention to that image and to that relationship without thinking about, and I am fully obsessed with Instagram and doing that free labor for Mark Zuckerberg, Inc. But without thinking about that kind of imagery. And I've had to really consciously draw a line there and say, I can't worry about the billions of other images that are fighting for space with mine, because then I just really need to focus closely, like keeping your own garden weeded and watered, that idea.
Yeah, just like building off some of the other conversation around interdisciplinarianism, and like I have from years ago a background in media studies. So the fact that these tools, photography, video, et cetera, have become so widely distributed, I feel that the kind of silos of expertise are starting to break down, and we really do all have permission to both become archivists and explore other archives. With Nelson's archive in particular, like, we were very lucky in terms of diving into it, because the story just emerges. Like, he is so charming, and he's one of the first vloggers. Like, he's widely known as possibly the first vlogger. He did this because it was fun to carry around a camcorder and document his life. And he's so charming, and he talks to the camera the whole time. And honestly, that makes me sort of very optimistic about the sort of stories we can find years from now with more people taking control over the documentation of their day-to-day life. I know, like, for many reasons, I'm really optimistic about it, but both in the fact that it's kind of disintegrating this idea of authority, and that there'll just be more stories to find, honestly.
I just wanted to say that in this current age, when there's a plethora of imagery, there's also a risk there, and much of this imagery is incredibly ephemeral or hosted in commercial archives that could disappear just with the drop of a hat if they have too bad quarterly earnings. You know, all of these pictures that have been uploaded to Instagram or Facebook and other places, or iCloud, could disappear as fast as a Studebaker or Newsweek magazine or, MySpace, for example. So we could actually, going forward, have a problem of memory, that everything is being documented, but everything is being forgotten. With my wife that I mentioned earlier that works with archives a lot, she noticed that when she's working in pre-video eras, she can find incredible footage. Anything that's been captured on film, she gets very, very high quality. And then you go to the 1980s, and all the videotapes degrade over time. The hard drives, the cassettes are no longer compatible. You can't find the VHS tapes or the Betamax tapes or the 8-tracks to plug in anymore. And this is something I noticed doing the glass plate negatives. I don't need a machine to read one of my glass plates. I can hold it up to the light and see the image. Try to find a zip drive from 10 years ago and figure out how to read that, or try to download something from a cloud service that's changed hands 15 times and you've lost your password. So I think we all have to be very vigilant about archiving going forward if we want, even though we're doing a plethora of recording, if we want it to be remembered for the long haul.
I think there's a difference between skepticism and cynicism, obviously, but with a lot of controversies that have popped up in our industry, it's easy to kind of start to feel down on the veracity of the work that we do. But it's worth exploring these new archives that are being built now, right? And thinking about what can be done with that. Imagine across all the projects that we're working on, if what we're trying to mine, there were these 15-second videos for all these characters we're trying to learn more about that we're all producing today by the millions. And yeah, you have to look at everything with a certain amount of criticism, but if you build up enough evidence in one direction, it's worth continuing down that path and thinking, okay, what else can I find here? And what can I compare this against, instead of maybe hitting dead ends with a lot of what's available the further back you go.
I was going to say, the way that Paulina and I talk to the young people about archiving is, there's this like cult of expertise around making these primary sources, around saying what culture is, around being our own archivists, which is why our histories aren't represented in the first place. So I guess that was the answer to my question I was having a minute ago. Never mind.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to this, like, the digital overload thing, that, like, histories that I'm studying, like, from even the 1970s into the present, like, that get recirculated on Instagram through, like, the Her Story page, which is, like, all lesbian photography-related posts. And then people who are just artists, curators, lovers of lesbian photography, like posting this week, Laura Aguilar passed, a really important photographer, Latinx photographer, and she has photos that include nude bodies. And they were taken down instantly by Instagram. And this is something that, like, what I do to archive that is I just, like, instantly start screenshotting when people post, like, what posts have been removed, and then I print it out, like, on a crappy laser printer, just so that I can remember everything that happens. It's not the first time, even this year, that lesbian content, like Zoe Leonard's I Want a Dyke for President, was taken down off of Instagram also this year, which just the word dyke is like, they can't handle it.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's anyone else with a burning question or comment. And
what if it's okay if part of what our work is that it's okay, my work, I'm not speaking about that at all, or anyone else's work, but what if I'm going through this work, part of this came from all the stuff in my parents' house that I kind of wish they would let go of. There's too much stuff, there's too much memory, they're held on really tight. And part of the reason that I want to do this project is so that I'm working with it and activating it. Like, the fact that it exists, they'll never forget anything. They have my grandmother's kindergarten report card, and that we don't need it. And so what if part of this is giving ourselves permission to let go? And, like, what if I'm giving my children the permission to forget me or their grandparents, if that's what they need to do to find their own way? And part of what gives all of us here such meaning is excavating these archives that weren't known about. So not that this video, the first video blogger, should be forgotten, but part of the excitement of it is, like, sharing it and excavating it. And what if it's okay if some of this goes into the slipstream of history? And I wouldn't ask anyone else to give their project that permission at all. And also, I'm speaking from a place of huge privilege as a white person who, like, my histories are often more part of the structure of things, but what if some of those could be let go of, sort of thinking about Hector's work, about the, I don't know, about the plinths. I just sort of wanted to look at the other side of archiving, of letting go, just asking that question. It might not be okay. That might be awful what I'm saying.
Alice says, burn it down.
To ask that question.
Thank you all so much for being with us and for this incredibly rich conversation. You all brought such incredibly different perspectives and approaches and gave us a lot to chew on. And I'd also like to invite all of you here to join us back at the Magnum Foundation for an after party at 6 o'clock. I do believe Noel has made some sangria. So the Magnum Foundation is on East 4th Street between Bowery and 2nd Avenue, and our festivities will start there at 6 o'clock. So please do join us back there. And many of the presenters will be there as well. And hopefully we'll be able to continue this conversation and to be able to do what we always hope to do at the Magnum Foundation, which is to create space for these kinds of conversations, whether in a massive auditorium or in our little home on East 4th Street. So again, thank you so much for coming, for being here today, and for joining in the conversation. Thanks again to the incredible Magnum Foundation staff, Noel, Jasmine, Emma, Afrisha over there, some of our team who are back at the office, Mung, who worked on the video, Katerina up there, Susan Mycelis.
And Kristen Levin.
And the presenters.
We really have to thank the good work.
Thank you so much.
It was teamwork.
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 Thank you.